They say you remember your worst moment forever. Mine happened in front of 200 wedding guests. I arrived at my sister Lily's wedding carrying an heirloom locket, a peace offering for years of being invisible. I'd paid their mortgage, fixed their roof, funded Lily's entire education. But when I politely asked the coordinator where I should sit, Lily's voice cut through the music like a knife. Adopted girls eat on the floor, not at the family table. My parents erupted in laughter. Relatives joined in. Camera flashes captured my humiliation. Every eye in that church watched me stand there, the charity case, the outsider, the girl who'd never be family no matter how much she gave. But here's what they didn't know. I wasn't that helpless, adopted girl anymore. I smiled, made one phone call, and within minutes, a $135,000 luxury sedan pulled up to that church while 200 guests watched through the windows. I walked out with my head high, leaving them frozen in confusion. Because you see, the house they were living in, I owned it. The mortgage they thought was Dad's, I'd bought it 2 years ago. And that joke Lily made, it violated every clause in the occupancy agreement Dad himself helped me write. The next morning they received their notice 3 days to vacate. But that was just the beginning. Because when I started digging into family records, I discovered something that would blow their perfect little lie wide open. A secret so explosive it would destroy everything they thought they knew about blood family and who really belonged. This is the story of how the girl they told to eat on the floor became the woman who owned the table. And trust me, you won't believe where this goes. My name is Vanessa Sullivan. I'm 37 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've built a career most people never see coming: supply chain management and corporate consulting. It's not glamorous, but it's powerful in quiet ways. I negotiate million-dollar contracts, restructure failing businesses, and solve problems that keep executives awake at night. I learned early that the people who control the flow of resources control everything. Maybe that's what happens when you grow up being told you should be grateful for scraps you learned to build your own table. The invitation to my sister Lily's wedding arrived 3 months ago, embossed with gold leaf and tied with silk ribbon. The kind of invitation that whispers old money, though I knew the truth. I'd quietly paid off $17,000 in wedding vendor deposits when Lily's credit cards maxed out. She never said thank you. Neither did our parents. But that was normal. In our family, I'd always been the ghost who paid the bills. Still, I wanted to believe this time might be different. A wedding is supposed to be about unity, forgiveness, new beginnings. So I went to my safe deposit box and retrieved the locket, a delicate silver piece that had belonged to our grandmother, passed down through generations. Inside were 2 tiny photographs I'd never quite understood. A baby with serious eyes, and a young woman whose face seemed hauntingly familiar, though I couldn't place her. I had it polished and planned to give it to Lily as a peace offering, a symbol that despite everything, I still wanted to be her sister. The day of the wedding was one of those perfect New England autumn afternoons where the light turns everything golden. The church stood proud and white against a backdrop of maples blazing red and orange, its tall steeple pointing toward a cloudless sky. White lilies lined the aisle in crystal vases, their perfume mixing with the scent of old wood and candle wax. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner. Cole Porter, if I remember correctly, while guests in their finest dresses and tailored suits gathered in murmuring clusters. Everything looked like a magazine spread for classic American elegance. I arrived alone, wearing a charcoal silk dress and simple pearl earrings. Nothing flashy. I've learned that real confidence doesn't need sequins. As I walked through the vestibule, several older guests recognized me immediately. Mrs. Patterson, who I'd driven to chemotherapy appointments when her daughter couldn't get time off work, squeezed my hand warmly. "Vanessa, dear, you look lovely. How's your business going?" Mr. Chen, whose grandson I'd helped get an internship at one of my client companies, gave me a genuine smile and asked about my mother's health. Ironic, since my mother barely acknowledged my existence in front of these same people. "You're such a blessing to this family," Mrs. Whitaker whispered, as she passed, patting my arm. I smiled and thanked her, even though I knew my family would never describe me that way. To them, I was the obligation, the outsider, the adopted girl who should be endlessly grateful they took me in. The ceremony was set to begin in 15 minutes, and guests were finding their seats. I noticed the seating chart displayed on an ornate easel near the entrance table, assignments written in careful calligraphy. I scanned for my name, expecting to find myself at a back table, maybe with distant cousins or my parents' work colleagues. But my name wasn't there. I checked again. Nothing. A young woman with a clipboard and a headset, clearly the wedding coordinator, rushed past, and I gently touched her elbow. "Excuse me. I'm Vanessa Sullivan, the bride's sister. I don't see my name on the seating chart. Could you help me find my table?" She looked flustered, flipping through papers on her clipboard. "Oh, let me check with the family. Just one moment." But before she could finish, Lily appeared from the bridal suite doorway in a cascade of white silk and lace. She looked beautiful. I'll admit that her hair perfectly curled, makeup flawless. The dress I knew cost $8,000, fitting like it was painted on. But it was her expression that stopped my heart. That smile. I knew that smile. It was the same one she'd worn at 13 when she told our 7th grade class I wasn't really her sister. The same smile she'd given at 18 when she forgot to include me in family photos at her high school graduation. She glided over her heels, clicking on the hardwood floor, and said loud enough for everyone in the vestibule to hear, "Adopted girls eat on the floor, not at the family table." The words hung in the air like shattered glass. The jazz quartet missed a note. Conversations died mid-sentence. I felt every eye in that space turn toward us, 50, maybe 60 people, all witnessing my humiliation. The photographer, sensing drama, swung his camera our direction. The shutter clicked, once, twice, capturing my face for posterity. And then, worse than the words themselves, my parents laughed. My father, Frank, in his rented tuxedo that I'd secretly paid the deposit for, let out a barking laugh. My mother, Margaret, wearing the pearl necklace I'd given her last Christmas, covered her mouth, but her shoulders shook with amusement. A few relatives, Aunt Carol, Uncle Jim, joined in with nervous, uncertain laughter, the kind that asks, "Are we allowed to think this is funny?" The coordinator looked horrified. Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly. Even Mr. Chen's smile had vanished, replaced by a look of profound disappointment directed at my parents, not at me. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse or make a scene or give them the satisfaction of breaking down. Instead, I felt something shift inside me like a door I'd been holding open for 37 years, finally quietly closing. I smiled. A real smile, calm and steady. I reached into my handbag and pulled out my phone. One call. That's all it took. "I'm ready," I said simply and ended the call. For 90 seconds I stood there in that vestibule while Lily's smile faltered slightly, while my parents exchanged confused glances, while guests whispered and shifted uncomfortably. Then we all heard it, the low, powerful purr of a high-performance engine pulling up outside. Through the church's open doors, we watched a sleek luxury sedan, midnight blue chrome accents, catching the autumn sun, glide to a stop directly in front of the entrance. The kind of car you see in magazines, not church parking lots. The kind of car that costs more than most of these guests earned in 2 years. I walked toward the door, every step measured and deliberate. I stopped at the gift table, removed the silver locket from my handbag, and placed it gently among the wrapped boxes and envelopes. No card, no explanation, just the heirloom that was never really meant for someone like her anyway. As I descended the church steps, the driver, my executive assistant, who I'd called ahead just in case I needed an exit strategy, opened the door. I slid into the leather interior and allowed myself one glance in the side mirror as we pulled away. My family stood frozen on the church steps. Lily's mouth slightly open, Frank's face red with confusion, Margaret gripping her pearls. The guests who'd gathered at the windows stared after me, their expressions ranging from shock to something that looked almost like admiration. They thought it was just a car. They had no idea who signed the title or what else I owned. The car's interior was quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine and the distant sound of jazz still playing from the church we'd left behind. My assistant Rachel knew better than to speak. She'd worked with me for 5 years and understood that sometimes silence was exactly what I needed. As we pulled onto the highway, the church steeple grew smaller in the distance until it disappeared completely behind a line of autumn trees. I leaned back against the leather seat and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were steady, my heart rate calm. Years of high-stakes business negotiations had taught me how to keep my body from betraying my emotions. But inside, behind the composure, something fundamental had shifted. I'd spent 37 years trying to earn a place at a table that was never meant for me. Today, in front of 200 witnesses, I'd finally understood the truth. Some people will never see your worth, no matter how much you prove it. My thoughts drifted back through the years like pages flipping in a book I'd rather not reread. I was 23 when Dad Frank had his first heart attack. I'd taken a week off from my entry-level consulting job, slept in the hospital waiting room, and quietly paid the $11,000 in medical bills his insurance didn't cover. He never asked how a recent college graduate had that kind of money. He never said thank you either. When I was 26, Mom's car died and she needed a replacement. I bought her a reliable sedan registered in her name, and she told her friends she'd saved up for years. My name never entered the story. Lily's college tuition appeared on my credit card statements for 4 consecutive years while she pledged a sorority and took spring break trips to Cancun. My own student loans took me 12 years to pay off because I was funding her education while working 60-hour weeks to build my career. When she graduated, the family threw her a party. When I'd graduated with honors, we had dinner at Applebee's, and Frank spent the entire meal talking about his golf game. 3 years ago, their roof started leaking. I hired contractors, paid for the replacement, and even upgraded the insulation. I supervised the entire project while managing a corporate merger on the side. When it was finished, Margaret hosted a holiday party and gave a speech thanking wonderful contractors and good fortune for their beautiful new roof. I stood in the corner holding a glass of wine nobody had offered to refill, listening to her take credit for my money and my time. And the photos. God, the photos. Every family portrait, every holiday card, every Facebook post showed the 3 of them, Frank, Margaret, and Lily, the perfect nuclear family. If I appeared at all, I was cropped at the edge, half a shoulder visible, or I was accidentally left out of the frame entirely. "Oh, Vanessa, you'd already left," they'd say, even though I'd been standing right there, even though I'd driven 2 hours to be there, even though I'd brought the wine and the dessert and arranged for the photographer. I reached into my handbag, my fingers finding the locket by touch. Wait, I'd left it on the gift table. Hadn't I? But no. Here it was solid and cool in my palm. In that moment of walking out, I must have picked it back up without consciously deciding to. Some part of me couldn't leave it behind for Lily. It had never really been meant for her anyway. I opened the delicate clasp and studied the 2 photographs inside for what must have been the 1,000th time in my life. On the left, a baby with serious dark eyes and wispy hair wearing a white christening gown. Me, presumably, though no one had ever confirmed it. On the right, a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, with eyes that looked exactly like mine. Same deep brown, same slight downturn at the outer corners, same intensity. I'd asked Margaret about her once when I was 15. "Just a relative," she'd said vaguely. "No one important," but the way she'd snatched the locket from my hands and hidden it in her jewelry box for 3 years suggested otherwise. My phone chimed and Rachel tapped the car's display screen to show the incoming message. It was from James Chen, my attorney. Not just any attorney, one of the best real estate and contract lawyers in the state. The message was brief, but significant. "Confirming we have all documentation ready regarding the property at 847 Maple Drive. The dignity and respect clause remains in effect per the occupancy agreement signed October 2022. Awaiting your instruction to proceed. All protocols in place." 847 Maple Drive. My parents' address. The house I'd saved from foreclosure 2 years ago, when Frank's commercial real estate venture collapsed spectacularly, leaving him $400,000 in debt. The bank was preparing to seize the property when I stepped in, negotiated a settlement, and purchased the mortgage myself. I became the legal owner, but I let them stay there rent-free. I'd even asked Frank, who fancied himself a legal expert because he'd taken some business law courses decades ago, to help me draft the occupancy agreement. He'd been so proud, peppering the document with protective clauses about the rights of occupants, about what would constitute violation of the agreement. He'd insisted on including what he called a dignity and respect provision, specifying that any public humiliation, verbal assault, or discriminatory treatment based on familial status would constitute a material breach of the agreement. "We need to protect ourselves," he'd said at the time, thinking he was shielding himself and Margaret from any future claims I might make. He never imagined that "adopted girls eat on the floor" would be the very phrase that activated his own carefully written clause. I told Rachel to pull over at the scenic overlook about 10 miles from the church. The view stretched across a valley painted in autumn colors, the kind of landscape that appears on postcards and calendar covers. I opened my laptop, the screen glowing in the fading afternoon light, and opened my voice memo app. I needed to hear myself say this, needed to create a record of this moment when everything changed. "My name is Vanessa Sullivan." I began, my voice steady. "Today is October 14th, and I'm making this recording to document a decision I've been avoiding for years. I chose to support my family not because I was weak or desperate for their approval, but because I believed love could transform people. I believed that if I was patient enough, kind enough, generous enough, they would eventually see me as I am. I was wrong. Today's public humiliation at Lily's wedding wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of 37 years of systematic erasure, emotional abuse, and exploitation. I don't want revenge. I want safety. I want dignity. And I want to stop teaching them that cruelty has no consequences. I ended the recording and saved it with the date and timestamp. Then I opened the legal document folder James had prepared months ago, the one I'd hoped I'd never need to use. The notice template appeared on my screen, blank fields waiting to be filled with dates and specific violations. I whispered to myself words that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Time to use my own rules. My finger hovered over the keyboard for just a moment before I clicked open the legal notice template and began to type. That evening, alone in my apartment with the legal documents spread across my dining table and a cold cup of tea forgotten beside my laptop, I found myself staring at the locket again. The faces inside looked back at me with questions I'd stopped asking years ago. Or maybe I'd just learned to bury them so deep that they stopped feeling like questions at all. But tonight, after everything, the old wounds felt fresh and demanding. My earliest memory is sitting in a courthouse when I was 5 years old. I remember wooden benches that smelled like lemon polish red stamps coming down on papers with official thuds, and a judge with kind eyes who smiled at me over his reading glasses. Margaret held me on her lap, her arms warm around me, and whispered, "You're ours now, sweetheart, forever and ever." I remember feeling safe in that moment, wanted. The memory is soft around the edges, dreamlike, the way all early childhood memories are. But it's there, solid enough that I've never questioned it. Until 3 years later, when I was 8 and supposed to be asleep. I'd gotten up for water and heard Margaret's voice drifting from the kitchen where she was on the phone with someone. Her tone was different from the sweet voice she used with me in public, sharper and strained. "She looks just like her," Margaret said, and there was something bitter in those words. "That's the problem. Every time I look at her face, I see it. I can't help it." I stood frozen in the hallway, my small hand gripping my empty cup, not understanding what she meant, but feeling the ice of it settle into my chest. The shift had already begun by then, I realize now. The warmth cooling degree by degree until I became something to be tolerated rather than treasured. By 15, I'd learned to be invisible, but I'd also learned to be curious. One afternoon, when everyone was out, I went searching through the filing cabinet in Frank's office where he kept all the important papers. I found my birth certificate in a manila folder marked with my name. The paper looked official enough, but when I held it up to the window light, I could see the telltale signs of correction fluid dried over the line labeled "Mother's Name." Someone had whited it out and typed over it. The letters didn't quite align with the rest of the text, and at the bottom in faded blue ink someone had handwritten blood-type notations. Baby AB+, with a date from 1987. I didn't know what it meant then, just filed it away as another oddity in a childhood full of them. High school became an exercise in achieving excellence that no one noticed. I made honor roll every semester, and Margaret would tape the certificate to the refrigerator with a proud smile for exactly 1 week. Then Lily would bring home a participation ribbon from soccer or art class, and my academic achievement would come down to make room for her mediocrity celebrated as triumph. I worked 2 jobs through college, waitressing on weekends and tutoring during the week, sleeping 4 hours a night to keep my grades high enough for scholarships. Meanwhile, Lily coasted through a state university on my parents' dime, changing majors 3 times and graduating with a communications degree she never used. I became the family fixer by default. Every Sunday, I'd drive 40 minutes to cook dinner for the 4 of us, spending my limited free time preparing pot roasts and apple pies that Frank would eat while reading the newspaper, barely acknowledging the effort. When he had gallbladder surgery my senior year of college, I took a week off from my internship to care for him. He complained that I was fluffing his pillows wrong, that the soup was too hot, that I should have known he wanted the television remote before he asked for it. Margaret thanked me by asking if I could stay an extra few days because having me there was so convenient. Before Lily's high school graduation party, I spent an entire Saturday repainting their front porch because Margaret worried about what the neighbors would think. My clothes were covered in white paint, my shoulders aching from hours of work. When guests arrived and complimented the porch, Margaret smiled graciously and said she'd finally gotten around to it. I stood inside holding a tray of appetizers I'd also prepared, invisible as always. The family photos were perhaps the cruelest cut. Every Christmas card, every Easter portrait, every vacation snapshot featured the 3 of them arranged in perfect symmetry. If I appeared at all, I was a blur at the edge of the frame, half cut off or conspicuously absent, despite having been present when the photo was taken. Margaret's Facebook was a shrine to my daughter Lily and our family that somehow never included me. Tonight, sitting with the weight of the day pressing down on me, I pulled out the cardboard box I kept in my bedroom closet. Inside were the fragments of a life lived in the margins, report cards, no one saved birthday cards I'd bought for myself, a program from my college graduation that only I had attended. At the bottom was something I'd forgotten about, a paper from a 10th grade health screening, where the school nurse had documented everyone's blood type. Mine read AB positive in her careful handwriting. Something nagged at me. I opened my laptop and searched blood type inheritance calculator. The genetics were clear. A child with AB+ blood must have parents with specific combinations. I pulled up the website and entered what I knew Frank's blood type was. O positive, I'd seen it on medical forms. Margaret's was B positive, I remembered from when she'd donated blood at a church drive. I entered my AB positive into the calculator and hit submit. The result flashed back immediately. This combination is genetically impossible. My hands started shaking. I went back to the box and found Margaret's old Bible, the one she'd given me years ago when she upgraded to a newer study version. Tucked in the Book of Psalms was a sealed envelope I'd never noticed before, yellowed with age. On the front, in Margaret's handwriting from decades ago, "For Vanessa, if she ever asks." I held the envelope up to the light but couldn't see through it. My finger traced the sealed edge. Not tonight. I wasn't ready for whatever truth was inside, but I was ready for answers. I grabbed my phone and searched for DNA ancestry testing, selecting the expedited processing option and overnight shipping. The kit would arrive tomorrow. Even silence can turn into power, I thought, when you know what questions to ask. The DNA kit would take weeks to process, but the legal documents in front of me required action now. I set aside the blood type mystery and the sealed envelope for later, and focused on what I could control in this moment. The house at 847 Maple Drive wasn't just my parents' address. It was mine. And it was time everyone understood what that meant. 2 years ago, Frank had called me on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice tight with panic, trying to sound casual. "Vanessa, honey, I need some financial advice." He never called me honey. That's how I knew it was bad. Over the next hour, he explained that his commercial real estate venture, the one he'd been so proud of, the one he'd bragged about at every family gathering, had collapsed. A strip mall project in a neighboring county had fallen through when the anchor tenant backed out, leaving Frank holding loans he couldn't service and contracts he couldn't fulfill. The bank had sent foreclosure notices on the family home, which he'd used as collateral for the business loans. $400,000 in debt. 60 days until they lost everything. "I thought maybe you could look at the numbers," he said, still unable to directly ask his adopted daughter for help. "Give me your professional opinion." I looked at the numbers. They were catastrophic. Frank had made every mistake a leveraged investor could make, betting on projections instead of fundamentals, ignoring market signals, and doubling down when he should have cut losses. The bank wasn't interested in restructuring. They wanted their money or the property, and they wanted it fast. I could have let it happen. I could have watched the house get seized, watched my parents scramble for an apartment they could afford on Frank's depleted retirement income, watched karma deliver the consequences they'd spent decades avoiding. Instead, I negotiated directly with the bank's commercial loan department. I purchased Frank's debt at a significant discount, paying $240,000 for obligations worth $400,000, and restructured the loan on terms that made sense. The house became mine legally and completely, but I offered them something Frank's pride desperately needed: the illusion of continuity. "You can stay here rent-free." I told them over coffee in their kitchen, now my kitchen though, we didn't say it that way. "For as long as you want. But we need a formal occupancy agreement for tax and legal purposes." Frank's jaw was tight. Accepting financial rescue from the daughter he'd always treated as lesser clearly burned, but desperation won. "I can help draft it," he offered, his way of clawing back some control. "I took business law courses. I know how these things should be structured." I agreed, knowing James Chen would review everything anyway. Frank threw himself into drafting that agreement like it was the most important contract of his life. He peppered it with protective language, carefully outlining the rights and responsibilities of occupants, the conditions under which the arrangement could be modified, and the procedures for dispute resolution. My attorney had recommended including a basic provision about maintaining a respectful living arrangement, standard language in occupancy agreements, to prevent situations from becoming hostile. But Frank wasn't satisfied with standard language. He insisted on strengthening it, adding specific definitions and examples. "We need to be protected from any false accusations," he explained to Margaret while I sat quietly at their dining table watching him dig his own legal grave with meticulous precision. He added phrases like public humiliation, verbal assault, and discriminatory treatment based on familial status. He specified that such violations would constitute material breach of the agreement, triggering a 14-day notice to vacate in accordance with state landlord-tenant law, with mediation offered as an alternative to immediate eviction proceedings. "This protects everyone," Frank said with satisfaction, signing the document with a flourish. He thought he was building a fortress around himself. He never imagined he was constructing his own cage. James had reviewed the final document and called me privately. "This is remarkably well documented," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Your father has essentially written an instruction manual for his own eviction if he ever crosses certain lines. The dignity and respect provision is actually stronger than what I would have recommended. It's enforceable, specific, and tied to clear consequences. If you ever need to use this, we have an airtight case." Now, 2 years later, I pulled up that agreement on my screen and read through Frank's carefully crafted language. Section 4, Paragraph 3. Any act of public humiliation, verbal assault, or discriminatory treatment directed at the property owner based on familial status, adoption status, or perceived family hierarchy shall constitute severe violation of this agreement. The wedding incident fit every element of that definition. Lily's words, spoken loudly in a public venue, specifically targeted my adoption status and treated it as grounds for exclusion and degradation. Frank and Margaret's laughter constituted endorsement and participation. I opened a new document and began drafting the formal notice to vacate, citing the specific provision, the specific incident, and the specific remedy: 14 days to vacate the premises. But alongside it, I drafted a second letter, this one personal. In it, I offered to pay for their relocation to a suitable apartment, cover 3 months of rent to ease the transition, and even attend family mediation sessions if they were willing to issue a genuine public apology and commit to ending all harassment. I spent an hour researching apartments in their area, ones with accessible features for their age near their church, and familiar stores within a reasonable budget. I compiled the list and attached it to the letter. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about drawing a line I should have drawn decades ago. The legal notice was the boundary. The personal letter was the bridge should they choose to cross it with humility and honesty. I knew which one they'd choose, but I had to offer both to live with myself. I hit print on both documents, watching them emerge from my printer 1 page at a time, knowing only one would be accepted. The documents sat on my desk for exactly 12 hours before I delivered them to James Chen's office for formal processing. By Monday morning, a professional process server was standing on the front porch of 847 Maple Drive, with an envelope containing both the legal notice and my personal letter. I'd timed it for 10 in the morning, a civilized hour when neighbors might be getting their mail or tending their gardens. Accountability, I'd learned, works best in daylight. I wasn't there to witness the delivery, but Mrs. Patterson called me within the hour. "Vanessa, dear," she said carefully, "I was outside watering my roses when a man in a suit delivered some papers to your parents." Frank opened the door and his face went absolutely white. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Mrs. Patterson," I assured her. "Just some overdue family business being handled properly." What I didn't tell her was that I'd specifically chosen a process server who arrived in a dark suit, carrying a leather portfolio, driving an unmarked sedan that looked official without being overtly threatening. Dignity mattered even in confrontation. The notice itself was printed on heavy legal stationery with James Chen's firm letterhead prominently displayed at the top. Chen & Associates was one of the most respected law firms in the state, known for handling complex real estate disputes and high-net-worth divorces. Frank would recognize that name immediately and understand he was facing an opponent with resources he couldn't match. The notice cited Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the occupancy agreement, quoted Lily's exact words from the wedding, and noted the date, time, and public nature of the violation. It was clinical, professional, and utterly damning. Attached behind it was my handwritten letter on personal stationery, offering the apartment listings the 3 months of financial support and the mediation option. 2 paths forward, one legal, one relational. I knew which one they'd take before I even sent it. Margaret called first, 45 minutes after service. Her voice was thick with tears, that particular quality of crying that demands sympathy and paints the crier as victim. "Vanessa, how can you do this to your own mother? After everything we've done for you, we gave you a home, a family, a name. This is how you repay us." I let her finish before responding calmly. "Mom, I paid off your house when you were about to lose it. I've supported this family financially and emotionally for 15 years. What happened at the wedding was a public humiliation that violated the agreement Dad himself drafted. I've offered mediation and financial help to relocate. The choice of how to proceed is yours." She hung up without another word. Frank's text arrived 10 minutes later, all capital letters and exclamation points. "You are an ungrateful betrayer. We took you in when no one wanted you. This is elder abuse. We will fight this, and we will win." I saved the text, added it to a folder I'd created specifically for documentation, and didn't respond. Rage wasn't an argument, and I wasn't interested in a screaming match. But it was Lily's call that afternoon that truly revealed how deep the toxicity ran. Her voice was sharp, entitled, completely lacking in self-awareness or remorse. What the hell do you think you're doing? You can't just throw our parents out of their home because your feelings got hurt at my wedding. You're pathetic, Vanessa. You've always been pathetic. Lily, you told me to eat on the floor in front of 200 people. That's not hurt feelings. That's a violation of the dignity clause in a legal contract. Oh, please, it was a joke. Everyone knew it was a joke. You're just bitter because you'll never have what I have. You think you can own us? You're nothing but the charity case we took pity on. Something in her voice made me pause. The phrasing was odd, rehearsed almost. Are you sure about that? I asked quietly. There was a beat of silence on the other end, just long enough for doubt to creep in. Then Lily made an angry sound and the line went dead. I saved that voicemail too, her words preserved in digital amber for whatever might come next. James sent over the mediation schedule later that evening. 3 available dates over the next 2 weeks, facilitated by a licensed family mediator held at a neutral location. The message was clear: this was their opportunity to remain in the home if they could demonstrate basic human decency and agree to respect boundaries going forward. All they had to do was show up, apologize genuinely, and commit to change. The next morning, Lily called again, her tone slightly different this time. Less openly hostile, more calculating. My husband Ethan says what you're doing is elder abuse and we should sue you. He knows lawyers. He knows people. This was the first I'd heard about a husband named Ethan, though I vaguely remembered the groom at the wedding, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who'd spent most of the reception on his phone. Ethan can consult whatever lawyers he likes, I said evenly. The contract is airtight. Ethan has connections, Lily continued. He got us amazing deals on all our wedding vendors through his business. He knows how things work. Business connections, wedding vendors. Something flickered in my memory. I pulled up my laptop while she was still talking and opened my company's vendor database. I typed Ethan into the search field along with logistics based on something I'd overheard at the wedding. Ethan Cole Logistics Solutions, a mid-sized firm that had contracts in our supply chain network. I'm sure Ethan is very well connected, I said mildly. I'll have my team look into the mediation schedule and get back to you. After I hung up, I sent a brief email to my audit department. Please conduct routine contract review of Cole Logistics Solutions. Standard due diligence, full records check. No rush, but prioritize for next quarterly audit. It was purely routine, I told myself. The kind of thing any responsible executive would do. My phone buzzed with one final text from Lily that evening, all venom and wounded pride. You think you can own us? I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed my response with steady fingers. I already do. The house, at least. The audit report landed on my desk 3 days later, delivered by my head of compliance, Richard Torres, who'd been with the company for 8 years and took his job with the seriousness of a surgeon. He set down a thick folder with colored tabs marking different sections and sat across from me with the expression of someone about to deliver bad news. We found some irregularities in the Cole Logistics contracts, he said without preamble. Significant ones. I wanted to bring these to you directly before we proceed with the standard protocols. I kept my face neutral, the same expression I wore in hostile negotiations when I couldn't afford to show my cards. Walk me through it. What I hadn't mentioned to Lily, what most people didn't know about my quiet career in supply chain management, was that 5 years ago I'd been offered a partnership stake in Meridian Supply Corporation, a mid-sized parent company that managed vendor contracts for dozens of clients across 6 states. I'd invested carefully built relationships, provided strategic guidance, and now held a controlling share that gave me significant oversight authority. Cole Logistics Solutions was one of approximately 40 vendors in our network, small enough that I'd never paid attention to the name until Lily mentioned Ethan's business connections. Richard opened the folder and spread out a series of invoices, each one flagged with sticky notes. Cole Logistics has been billing for freight services at rates approximately 30% above market average. That alone isn't fraud just expensive, but look at these. He pointed to a series of line items labeled Logistics Consulting Services and supply chain optimization fees paid to 3 different companies with generic names: Summit Business Solutions, Apex Consulting Group, and North Star Strategic Services. Shell companies, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Almost certainly. We ran the business registrations. All 3 were incorporated in Delaware within the same month 2 years ago, all listing the same registered agent service, and none of them have any web presence, employee listings, or verifiable business operations. The consulting fees total about $200,000 over 18 months paid in regular installments that carefully stay just below the threshold that would trigger automatic executive review. My hands tightened on the folder, but I kept my voice level. What else, then? IP access logs show someone using Ethan Cole's credentials logged into our confidential vendor portal after hours on 17 separate occasions over the past year. They accessed bid information for competitive contracts, pricing structures from other vendors, and client requirement documents that should have been restricted. Whoever it was knew exactly what to look for and when to look for it. Richard pulled out another document, this one showing signatures on the Shell Company registration papers and banking authorizations. My breath caught when I saw the name on the signature line for Summit Business Solutions, Lily M. Sullivan, title listed as financial consultant. "Do you recognize this person?" Richard asked, watching my face carefully. "Yes," I said quietly. "That's my sister." To his credit, Richard didn't flinch or change expression. "I see. That complicates things, but it doesn't change our obligations. With your permission, I'd like to expand the investigation to include email communications. If there's a conspiracy here, we need to document the full scope before we report to authorities." I knotted my throat tight. "Do it. Full investigation, standard protocols, no special treatment. I'm recusing myself from any disciplinary decisions to avoid conflict of interest, but this proceeds by the book." Richard left with the folder, and I sat alone in my office as the autumn afternoon light slanted through the windows. An hour later, he returned with printouts of email exchanges pulled from the company server messages between Ethan's corporate email and several personal email addresses that traced back to Lily. I forced myself to read them. The first one, dated 14 months ago, was from Lily to Ethan. "Just do it, babe. Vanessa's too stupid to notice anything. She's just a charity case anyway. Dad says she barely passed high school and got lucky in business. She won't catch on." The casual cruelty of it, the complete fabrication about my academic record. I'd graduated 3rd in my class. Felt like a physical blow. Another email from 3 months ago showed Lily coaching Ethan on excuses. "If anyone asks about the Summit invoice, tell them it was for market analysis during your family emergency last spring. They can't question that without looking heartless." There was no family emergency last spring. It was simply a convenient lie, and Lily had supplied it without hesitation. A more recent exchange from 6 weeks ago had Lily expressing not guilt, but entitlement. "We deserve this money more than some random vendors. Vanessa owes us for taking her in and giving her a name. She wouldn't even have a career if we hadn't raised her. This is just collecting what we're owed." The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Lily wasn't a victim of Ethan's schemes. She was an architect, a willing participant who viewed defrauding my company as justified payback for the crime of being adopted. They'd stolen roughly $200,000 over 18 months, using shell companies Lily had helped create, covering their tracks with lies she'd crafted, all while believing I was too stupid and too grateful to ever notice. Richard stood in my doorway again, his expression grave. "This is enough for criminal referral. Wire fraud, theft, conspiracy, possibly RICO predicates given the interstate nature and the shell company structure. We're legally obligated to report this to both law enforcement and the relevant regulatory agencies. I need your authorization to proceed." I looked down at the emails at my sister's words printed in black and white at the evidence of contempt and theft and calculated betrayal. Part of me wanted to protect her, still wanted to believe there was some explanation that would make this hurt less. But the evidence didn't lie, and neither did company policy or the law. "Proceed with the standard protocol." I said, my voice steady despite the pain crushing my chest. Complete the investigation, document everything, and prepare the reports. I'll sign off on the law enforcement referral when you're ready. No special treatment, no warnings. If they've committed fraud, they face the consequences. After Richard left, I sat alone with the file open in front of me. Lily's words staring back at me from the page. I closed the folder carefully and whispered to the empty room. I gave them a home. They stole from my company. Where does family end and justice begin? That Sunday morning, I woke with a knot of dread in my stomach that had nothing to do with the fraud investigation and everything to do with walking into church knowing the gossip machine had been running at full capacity for a week. Small towns are like that. Information travels faster than sympathy, and everyone has an opinion about situations they don't fully understand. Still, I'd attended Grace Community Church for 15 years, through every holiday and crisis and quiet Sunday in between. I wasn't about to let shame or fear keep me away from the one place that had always offered actual grace. I arrived 10 minutes early, as was my habit, and the whispers started before I even reached the door. 2 women I recognized from the altar guild stood near the entrance, their conversation dropping to pointed silence as I passed. Inside, clusters of congregants turned slightly as I walked down the aisle, their glances quick and assessing. I heard fragments of sentences floating through the sanctuary. Eviction notice. That car at the wedding. Always seemed so quiet. I kept my head up and my expression calm, greeting people by name as I always did, asking Mrs. Chen about her new grandson and Mr. Patterson about his knee surgery recovery. The coffee hour setup was already underway in the fellowship hall, and I joined the volunteers arranging cookies on trays and filling the large silver urns. Mrs. Whitaker, who had to be pushing 85, worked beside me in companionable silence for a few minutes before she placed her wrinkled hand over mine. "We see you, dear," she whispered, her eyes bright with understanding. "We always have." The words hit me harder than I expected, a recognition I hadn't realized I'd been craving. She patted my hand once more and returned to arranging napkins, but that simple gesture steadied something in me that had been shaking since the wedding. I noticed my parents' usual pew remained conspicuously empty as the service began. Frank and Margaret hadn't missed a Sunday in 20 years, their attendance more about maintaining appearances than genuine faith, but their absence today spoke volumes. Lily wasn't there either, though she'd only attended sporadically since moving out years ago. The empty pew felt like an accusation and a relief simultaneously. Pastor Michael took the pulpit for his sermon, and I wondered if he'd heard the gossip, if he knew half the congregation was watching me for signs of breakdown or vindication. His text was from Matthew, the passage about removing the plank from your own eye before addressing the speck in your brother's eye, but his application took an unexpected turn. "There's a difference we often confuse," he began, his voice carrying that particular quality of pastoral authority mixed with grandfatherly warmth. "We confuse forgiveness with reconciliation, boundaries with unforgiveness, and self-protection with revenge." I sat up straighter, my bulletin clutched in my hands. "Forgiveness is an internal act," he continued. "It's the choice to release bitterness and refuse to let someone else's sin poison your own soul. It's freedom you give yourself, not permission you give them to continue hurting you. But reconciliation, true reconciliation that requires 2 people. It requires genuine repentance from the offender and a safe environment for the wounded. We are absolutely called to forgive. We are not called to accept ongoing abuse in the name of keeping peace." Tears started rolling down my cheeks before I could stop them, not from sadness, but from the profound relief of having someone in authority say what I'd been trying to articulate to myself for weeks. Pastor Michael's voice grew stronger. "Even Jesus, our model of mercy and grace, overturned tables when the temple's holiness was being violated. Even Jesus told his disciples to shake the dust off their feet and leave towns that rejected them. Setting boundaries isn't unchristian. Sometimes it's the most faithful thing we can do." I fumbled for a pen and scribbled in the margin of my bulletin, my handwriting shaky, Forgive I'll free myself. Reconcile equals requires their change, plus my safety. The distinction felt like a key turning in a lock I'd been trying to force open for years. After the service, as I stood in the fellowship hall with a styrofoam cup of mediocre coffee, my cousin Jennifer approached with her phone already out. She was 28, well-meaning, but thoroughly marinated in social media culture. "Vanessa, you should totally tell your side of the story on Facebook," she said earnestly. "Like, do a whole post explaining what really happened at the wedding and why you had to serve the eviction notice. People are saying all kinds of things, and you deserve to defend yourself." I took a sip of coffee, considering my words carefully. "I appreciate that, Jennifer, but I'm not going to fight this battle on social media. The truth will speak for itself through the proper channels. I don't need to win a public opinion war. I need to act with integrity in private and let the facts do whatever they're going to do." She looked disappointed but nodded. "That's really mature, I guess. I just hate seeing people trash talk you when they don't know the whole story." "They'll know what they need to know when they need to know it," I said gently. "Thank you for caring." As I walked to my car through the October sunshine, the church bells chiming noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel, my assistant. "Audit packet ready, sensitive details inside. When do you want to review?" My hand trembled as I unlocked the car door, the keys jingling against the metal. I sat in the driver's seat with the door still open, staring at that message on my screen. The audit packet would contain the full scope of Ethan and Lily's fraud, every email, every invoice, every piece of evidence that would turn family dysfunction into criminal charges. Opening it meant crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross, setting in motion a chain of events that would end with my sister potentially facing prison time. But not opening it meant ignoring theft, fraud, and a conspiracy that had been built on the assumption that I was too stupid and too grateful to ever notice. I sat in the parking lot, engine off, staring at the message. Once I open this, there's no going back. I opened the audit packet that afternoon, and the contents were exactly as damning as I'd feared. Over the next 4 weeks, my life became a careful compartmentalization of crises, each one demanding attention, while I waited for the DNA results that might explain the deepest mystery of all. I attended 2 mediation prep sessions with James Chen, reviewing the occupancy agreement and the wedding incident from every legal angle. My parents had refused the first scheduled mediation date entirely, sending a terse message through their attorney, a solo practitioner Frank had found who specialized in small claims disputes, clearly out of his depth against a firm like Chen and Associates. I spent hours researching apartments that would suit my parents' needs, compiling spreadsheets with accessibility features, proximity to their church, and doctors' monthly costs they could afford on Frank's diminished retirement income. Even now, even after everything, some part of me was still trying to solve their problems. The fraud investigation moved forward with bureaucratic precision, interviews with Ethan's employees, forensic accounting reviews, coordination with federal prosecutors who found the interstate wire transfers particularly interesting. And every Sunday, I sat in that same church pew, drew strength from Pastor Michael's sermons, and felt the community's perception of me slowly shifting from confused to quietly supportive. But underneath all of it, like a drumbeat I couldn't quite hear, but could feel in my bones, was the waiting. The DNA test company had promised results in 4 to 6 weeks with expedited processing. I checked my email compulsively, sometimes 3 or 4 times an hour, my stomach clenching each time I saw a new message notification that turned out to be something mundane. The results finally came on a Tuesday night, 4 weeks and 3 days after I'd mailed the sample. I was in my office reviewing a supply chain proposal that needed approval by morning, when the email notification appeared on my screen: "Your ancestry genetics DNA results are ready." My hands started shaking before I even clicked the link. I stood up, paced to the window overlooking the city lights, came back to my desk, and finally forced myself to open the PDF attachment. The summary page loaded first, showing a pie chart of my ethnic background. Northwestern European, trace amounts of Scandinavian, nothing surprising for someone raised in New England. But it was the second page, the one titled "Close Family Matches," that made the room tilt sideways. Margaret Sullivan, 50%, DNA shared relationship confidence, 99.9%. Predicted relationship. Mother. My eyes tracked down to the next entry, Frank Sullivan, 0% DNA shared, no genetic relationship detected. I read those lines 3 times, 4 times, trying to make them say something different than what they clearly stated. Margaret was my biological mother. Not my adoptive mother. Not someone who'd taken me in out of charity, but my actual mother, who had carried me for 9 months and given birth to me. Frank, on the other hand, shared no genetic material with me whatsoever. He wasn't my father in any biological sense. The adoption story was a lie, but not the lie I'd expected. I wasn't some stranger's child they'd charitably rescued. I was Margaret's daughter, hidden behind a false narrative for reasons I couldn't yet fathom. My mind raced back to that overheard phone conversation when I was 8. She looks just like her. That's the problem. Who was her? And why was resemblance a problem? I pulled out the old health screening form I'd saved, the one with my blood type notation, AB positive. I opened a new browser tab and searched for blood type inheritance calculators, entering what I knew. Margaret was B positive. I'd seen it on medical forms over the years. Frank was O positive, documented in his hospital records from his heart attack. I entered AB positive as the child's blood type and clicked calculate. The result appeared instantly in red text. This combination is genetically impossible. A person with AB blood type cannot be the biological child of 2 parents with O and B blood types. The science was clear and unforgiving. Margaret could be my mother, but Frank could not be my father. Someone with A or AB blood had contributed the other half of my genetic code. Someone Margaret had been with either before Frank or during their marriage. Someone whose existence had been erased so thoroughly that I'd lived 37 years without knowing he'd ever existed. The next morning, exhausted from a sleepless night spent staring at DNA results and blood type charts, I called a family law attorney whose name I'd found through a colleague's recommendation. Susan Hartwell specialized in adoption disputes and sealed record cases, and her voice on the phone was professional but warm. I explained the situation as concisely as I could, the adoption story I'd been told, the DNA results that contradicted it, the sealed courthouse records from 1988 that I'd discovered while researching my birth certificate. "This is more common than you'd think," Susan said after I'd finished. Especially in the 80s, families sometimes used legal adoption mechanisms to hide out-of-wedlock births or affairs. The adoption paperwork makes it look like charity when it's actually covering up scandal. The good news is you have solid grounds to petition for unsealing those records. She outlined 3 legal arguments we could make. First, DNA evidence suggesting fraud in the original adoption proceedings, since I wasn't actually adopted in any traditional sense. Second, the impact on current property rights and inheritance disputes, given that my legal status was being contested in the mediation process. Third, potential medical necessity, since not knowing my biological father's health history could affect my own medical care. All 3 arguments together created what she called compelling cause to override the 1988 court order sealing the records. "How long will it take?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter than necessary. "I'll file an emergency petition this afternoon. Given the circumstances, especially the active property dispute, I think we can get a hearing within a week or 2. Judge Martinez handles these cases in family court, and she's generally sympathetic to adult adoptees seeking information about their origins." The petition was filed that same day, and Susan called me back 48 hours later. "We got lucky," she said. "Judge Martinez had a cancellation next week, and she's moved your hearing up Thursday at 10 in the morning. It'll be a closed hearing, just you, me, the court clerk, and the judge. If she grants the petition, the sealed file will be opened, and you'll have access to everything: the original birth certificate, court documents, any letters or statements filed with the case." On Friday afternoon, the court clerk called to confirm the details. Her voice was matter-of-fact, reviewing the case number and hearing time, but then she added something that made my breath catch. I pulled the file to prepare for the judge's review. "It's sealed by court order from 1988. Multiple documents, looks like there might be some correspondence in there too. But we have your hearing scheduled for next week, so you'll know everything soon enough." Everything. Soon enough. The words echoed in my head long after I hung up the phone. The hearing took place in a small courtroom that smelled of old wood and legal documents, the kind of space where life-altering decisions happen in quiet voices rather than dramatic pronouncements. Judge Martinez was a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that suggested she'd heard every family secret the county had to offer. Susan sat beside me at the petitioner's table while the judge reviewed our filing, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she flipped through pages. "Ms. Sullivan," the judge began, looking up at me. "You're petitioning to unseal adoption records from 1988 on the grounds that the adoption may have been fraudulent and that you have a legitimate need to know your biological parentage. Your DNA evidence is compelling. I'm prepared to grant this petition, but I want you to understand that what's in this file may be difficult to read. Court records from this era sometimes contain painful family histories. Are you certain you want to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to know the truth." She nodded and gestured to the clerk, who brought forward a sealed manila folder marked with my name and a case number from 1988. The judge broke the seal herself, the sound of tearing paper unnaturally loud in the quiet courtroom. She read silently for several minutes, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to something that looked like sadness tinged with anger. Finally, she looked up at me. "Ms. Sullivan, these records tell a story of coercion and control, not adoption in any traditional sense. I'm going to read the relevant sections aloud for the record, and then these documents will be released to you." She pulled out the first page, an original birth certificate. "You were born on March 15, 1988 at County General Hospital. Your mother is listed as Margaret Ann Whitmore, age 19, unmarried. Your father is listed as Robert James Sullivan, age 26, attorney. Robert Sullivan died in a motor vehicle accident on January 3, 1988, approximately 2 months before your birth." The name hit me like a physical blow. Sullivan. My last name wasn't adopted from Frank. It came from my biological father, a man I'd never known existed until this moment. Judge Martinez continued, pulling out additional documents. "There's a marriage certificate here dated April 1988, 1 month after your birth. Margaret Ann Whitmore married Frank Edward Sullivan, no relation to Robert Sullivan despite sharing a surname. According to the court filing, Frank Sullivan was a business colleague of your deceased father, and he proposed marriage to Margaret ostensibly to provide stability for her and the infant." "But there's more," the judge said, her voice taking on an edge. "In 1990, when you were 2 years old, a petition was filed to legally classify your status as adopted, despite no actual adoption having taken place. The petition claimed this was necessary for tax and estate planning purposes. Margaret Sullivan filed a handwritten letter with that petition." She held up several pages of lined notebook paper covered in handwriting that I recognized as my mother's, younger and less shaky than it was now. The judge read aloud, "I petition this court to seal these records to protect my daughter Vanessa from shame and social stigma. My husband Frank says if I don't agree to this legal arrangement, he will petition for full custody of both children on grounds of my mental instability and moral unfitness as a mother. He has already drafted preliminary papers and shown them to me. I am weak and afraid. I have a new baby daughter, Lily, who is Frank's biological child, and I cannot risk losing both my children. I am sorry, Vanessa. If you ever read this, know that you were the only love I was ever allowed to choose. Your father, Robert, loved us both, and Frank has made me erase him from history. I am so sorry." My hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. The judge pulled out another document, this one typed on legal letterhead. "These are the preliminary custody papers Frank Sullivan filed as leverage. He claimed Margaret was emotionally unstable due to her promiscuous past and inability to properly parent a child born out of wedlock. The papers were withdrawn 3 days after Margaret agreed to the adoption reclassification and the sealing of records." Susan's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently. The judge continued, laying out the documents like cards in a terrible game. Birth certificate for Lily. Margaret Sullivan, born 1990. Father listed as Frank Sullivan. Court orders sealing the original records. A copy of the fraudulent adoption paperwork that made it appear I'd been taken in from some distant relative rather than being Margaret's own flesh and blood. There's one more document, Judge Martinez said quietly. A notarized statement from Robert Sullivan's law firm dated 1987, establishing a trust fund for any child born to Margaret Whitmore. The trust was to be administered by Robert's brother, James Sullivan, and held for the benefit of Robert's child until age 21. According to this notation, Frank Sullivan blocked all attempts by James Sullivan to contact Margaret or the child after Robert's death. The full picture assembled itself in my mind like a puzzle whose pieces had been scattered for 37 years. Robert Sullivan. My biological father had loved Margaret and wanted to marry her. He'd died before I was born, leaving her alone and pregnant and vulnerable. Frank had swooped in, not out of love or charity, but out of possessive desire for Margaret, and perhaps calculated ambition to control Robert's legacy. He'd married her, given me his surname to maintain the appearance of legitimacy, but then systematically erased my father from existence and reframed my entire identity as an act of charity rather than an inheritance of love. Frank had treated me as a useful asset because that's exactly what I was to him, a financial safety net he could train and control someone who owed him eternal gratitude for a rescue that never actually happened. The adoption story had served every purpose he needed. It explained my presence without acknowledging Margaret's sin. It positioned him as magnanimous. It gave him legal leverage over any inheritance questions. And most cruelly, it gave him a weapon to wield against me psychologically for my entire life. I wasn't unloved because I was adopted. I was called adopted because Frank couldn't love what he didn't own, couldn't cherish what reminded him daily that Margaret's heart had belonged to someone else first. My voice came out cracked and raw when I finally spoke. So Frank wasn't saving us. He was buying us, me and Mom, like assets in a portfolio. Judge Martinez removed her glasses and looked at me with genuine compassion. Ms. Sullivan. What Frank Sullivan did to your mother was coercive control. What he did to you was systematic psychological abuse built on a foundation of lies. These records are now unsealed and legally yours. I'm also noting in my order that any claims Frank Sullivan might make regarding your legal status as adopted are fraudulent and without merit. You are Margaret Sullivan's biological daughter and Robert Sullivan's heir. That has always been true, regardless of what lies were told. The mediation session was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a neutral location, a conference room in a professional building downtown, with bland beige walls and a table large enough to seat 8 people with uncomfortable amounts of space between them. I arrived 15 minutes early, with James Chen, who'd replaced Susan Hartwell as my primary attorney once the property dispute and the parentage revelation had become legally intertwined. The mediator, a woman named Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who specialized in high-conflict family disputes, greeted us with professional warmth and reviewed the ground rules while we waited. Frank and Margaret arrived exactly on time. Margaret's eyes already red-rimmed and swollen, Frank's jaw set in that particular expression of righteous anger he wore whenever someone dared to question him. Lily came in behind them looking uncertain and afraid in a way I'd never seen before. Their attorney, the overmatched solo practitioner named Gerald Moss, carried a briefcase that looked more prop than tool. We all took our seats, the unsealed court file sitting in front of me like a loaded weapon I was about to discharge. Dr. Hernandez began with her standard opening about respectful communication and the goal of finding mutually acceptable solutions, but I interrupted her gently. Before we discuss housing arrangements or financial settlements, there's something everyone in this room needs to understand. I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I placed my hand on the folder. I know everything now. Frank's face drained of color so quickly, I thought he might faint. Margaret made a small sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob, and her hands flew to her mouth. Even before I opened the folder, she knew exactly what was inside. I am not adopted, I said, looking directly at Frank. I am Margaret's biological daughter. You have been perpetuating a lie for 37 years to control both of us. I slid copies of the DNA results across the table, the pages landing in front of Frank with a soft rustle. Then the court documents. Then Margaret's handwritten letter from 1990, her words of fear and apology, now public record. Dr. Hernandez picked up the letter, her professional neutrality cracking as she read Margaret's confession about Frank's custody threats and coercion. She set it down carefully and looked at Frank with an expression I could only describe as cold assessment. "These are sealed court records," Gerald Moss said weakly, flipping through the pages. "How did you—" "Unsealed by court order last week," James Chen said crisply. "Judge Martinez found compelling evidence of fraud in the original proceedings. Everything here is now part of the legal record and admissible in any related proceedings." Frank found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. "We were protecting you from shame, Vanessa. It was a different time. People would have judged Margaret, judged you. We gave you a stable home, a good life. Everything we did was for your benefit." Something hot and sharp rose in my chest. "You gave me a life where I was told I should be grateful for scraps," I said, my voice rising slightly despite my intention to stay calm. "Where my own sister was taught to mock me for being adopted. Where I paid your debts and fixed your home and funded Lily's education while being excluded from family photos. Where I was treated as a useful asset instead of a daughter. You didn't protect me from shame, Frank. You weaponized shame against me for your own control." Margaret was sobbing openly now, her whole body shaking. She reached across the table toward me, her hand trembling. "I'm so sorry, baby. I was so scared. He said he'd take you both. He showed me the papers. I didn't know what to do. I was 19 and alone, and I thought I was protecting you both by just going along with it." Her voice broke completely. "I loved your father. Robert was good and kind, and he wanted you so much. Frank made me erase him. I'm so sorry." Lily sat frozen, her face pale, staring at the documents in front of her as though they were written in a language she was still learning to translate. "Your mom's biological daughter," she whispered. "But you're adopted. That's what I was always told. That's what everyone said. That's what Frank wanted everyone to believe," I said, looking at my sister with something closer to pity than anger. "Because it served his purposes. It made him look charitable. It gave him psychological leverage over me. And it taught you that I was lesser other someone who should be grateful instead of equal." Frank stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. We're done here. Come on, Margaret." But his voice lacked its usual authority. He looked cornered, desperate, a man watching his carefully constructed house of lies collapse in real time. "Sit down," I said quietly. "We're not done. There's also the matter of the fire you're planning." Frank froze halfway to the door. The room went absolutely silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and Margaret's ragged breathing. "What are you talking about?" he said, but his voice had gone thin and uncertain. I pulled a USB drive from my briefcase and slid it across the table. "Margaret found the security tablet footage from your home system. You in the garage preparing containers of gasoline 2 days before Lily's wedding, before I served any eviction notice, before there was any public conflict. You were already planning to destroy evidence." I looked at James, who nodded confirmation that we'd reviewed the footage with a digital forensics expert to verify its authenticity and timestamp. Dr. Hernandez's expression had shifted from mediator to mandatory reporter. "Mr. Sullivan, if there's evidence of planned arson, I'm legally obligated to report this to law enforcement. This mediation is suspended until—" "What fire?" Lily's voice cut through the room, shaking and confused. "Dad, what is she talking about? What fire? What evidence?" Frank said nothing. He stood there, one hand still on his chair, his face a mixture of rage and trapped animal fear. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating until it became its own answer. Margaret stared at her husband with dawning horror. Lily looked between her father and me, trying to piece together a puzzle she'd never known existed. Frank's silence was the loudest answer in the room. The discovery of the tablet had happened 1 week before the mediation, though it felt like a lifetime ago now as I watched Frank's face turn ashen in that conference room. Margaret had been staying in my guest room since the initial confrontation, too afraid to be alone with Frank after learning what he'd done to her decades ago. She'd asked if she could return to the house briefly to collect some personal items, photo albums, jewelry, her grandmother's quilt things she didn't want to lose if the eviction proceeded. I'd offered to go with her, but she'd insisted on going alone during the day when Frank would be at his weekly poker game. "I need to do this by myself," she'd said. "I need to see that house one more time and remember what was real and what was performance." She'd called me 2 hours later, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her words. "Vanessa, you need to come here right now. I found something. Oh God, I found what he was planning." I'd driven over immediately, my heart pounding, and found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with an old tablet in her hands, the kind Frank had installed years ago as part of a home security system he'd mostly forgotten about. The device had been tucked in a drawer in his office, unplugged and neglected, but Margaret had found it while looking for an old address book. She'd plugged it in to see if any of her old photos might be backed up on it. What she found instead was security footage automatically synced to the cloud showing the interior of their garage. The timestamp read 2 days before Lily's wedding. Frank appeared in the frame looking around furtively before pulling out several red plastic gasoline containers. He filled them methodically from a larger canister, checking his watch multiple times as though timing something. Then he made a phone call, the tablet's microphone, picking up his voice clearly in the quiet garage. "It's me," Frank had said. "Everything's set for after the wedding. Once Vanessa makes a scene or refuses to come, we'll have public witnesses that she's unstable. Then we execute the plan and she'll have no standing to challenge anything." He'd paused, listening to someone on the other end. "Yes, the insurance is in place. The rider covers total loss. Just make sure you're ready with the consulting invoices to justify the payout." Margaret had watched this footage 3 times before calling me. She admitted, unable to believe what she was seeing. But it got worse. The tablet had also captured audio from Frank's office where apparently he'd had conversations without realizing the security system was recording. We scrolled back through dates, finding snippets of phone calls and in-person meetings. 3 weeks before the wedding, there was a conversation between Frank and a male voice I didn't immediately recognize. Margaret identified it as Ethan Lily's husband, who'd apparently been to the house several times when Lily wasn't there. "If we burn the originals, she can't prove ownership," Ethan's voice said clearly through the tablet's speaker. "The occupancy agreement, the financial records, all the paper trail gone. Then Lily inherits as the biological daughter and we're clear." Frank's response made my blood run cold. "And once Lily owns it, we liquidate, split the insurance money, and I retire to Florida like we planned. Vanessa will have no proof, no standing. She'll probably try to fight it, but without documentation, it's our word against hers. And who's going to believe the adopted charity case over the biological family?" They'd been planning this for months, possibly longer. This wasn't a desperate reaction to my serving the eviction notice. This was premeditated conspiracy, and I was just the obstacle they'd decided to eliminate through fraud and fire. I'd immediately contacted James Chen, who brought in a digital forensics expert to verify the footage's authenticity and ensure the chain of custody would hold up in court. The expert confirmed the timestamps were legitimate. The cloud sync records showed no tampering, and the audio quality was sufficient for voice identification if needed. But James had suggested we dig deeper into Frank's recent financial activities, and what we found was even more damning. 6 months ago, Frank had contacted his insurance agent to increase the homeowner's policy substantially. The agent's notes, which we obtained through a legal subpoena James filed, showed Frank had added a special rider for total loss replacement value that would pay out $800,000, nearly double what the house was actually worth. The insurance agent had noted Frank's specific questions. "If there's a fire and the house is completely destroyed, that's covered, right? What about if someone is inside? Is that still covered under the policy?" The agent had assured him that accidental death in a house fire would not void the property claim. But there was more. Frank had also taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on Margaret just 4 months ago, listing himself as the primary beneficiary at 70% and Lily as secondary at 30%. Margaret had signed the paperwork, she told me, through tears because Frank said it was just standard estate planning for people our age. She hadn't thought to question why the policy was so large or why it had been purchased so suddenly. The insurance agent's notes on that policy included another chilling detail. Frank had asked about the contestability period and whether suicide or accidental death would be treated differently. He'd wanted to know specifically about smoke inhalation deaths and house fires. The agent had answered his questions professionally, not realizing he was potentially providing information for a murder plot. James had taken all of this evidence directly to the district attorney's office, bypassing normal channels because of the severity and the apparent immediate danger to Margaret. That's how Detective Sarah Morrison had gotten involved, a 20-year veteran of the arson investigation unit who'd seen enough insurance fraud cases to recognize a textbook setup. She'd come to my office 3 days before the mediation, her expression grave as she reviewed the tablet footage and the insurance documents. "Ms. Sullivan," she'd said, setting down the papers and looking at me directly, "we need you to testify before a grand jury. This is conspiracy to commit arson and insurance fraud, definitely. But given the life insurance policy, the questions about people being inside during a fire and the timing of everything, we're also looking at possible attempted murder. If Frank had gone through with this plan and your mother had been in that house..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The detective had asked me to wear a wire to the mediation session to see if Frank would say anything incriminating when confronted. I'd refused, not wanting to turn what should have been a family reconciliation attempt into a sting operation. But I'd agreed to record the session with everyone's legal consent, as was standard in mediation, and to preserve any statements Frank made for potential criminal proceedings. Now, watching Frank stand frozen in that conference room, his silence confirming everything the evidence already proved, I understood that we'd moved far beyond family dysfunction into criminal conspiracy. The detective's words echoed in my mind: conspiracy to commit arson, insurance fraud, and possibly attempted murder. After the mediation collapsed, Detective Morrison had explained to me why Frank couldn't be arrested immediately despite the overwhelming evidence. "We want him and Ethan together if possible," she'd said. "If we arrest Frank now, Ethan will lawyer up and claim he was just talking hypothetically on those recordings. But if we catch them in the act or attempting to execute the plan, we have both of them cold. It's worth the wait for a stronger case." She'd assured me that the house would be under 24-hour surveillance, that Margaret would stay with me where she'd be safe, and that the moment Frank made any move toward that property, they'd have units ready to intervene. What none of us anticipated was Margaret's insomnia-driven sentimentality. 2 nights after the mediation, I woke at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and noticed the guest room door open, the bed empty. My heart lurched. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, even the small balcony, but Margaret wasn't in my apartment. Her purse was gone. Her keys were gone. I called her cell phone and it went straight to voicemail. Then I called Detective Morrison, my hands shaking as I explained that Margaret had apparently left without telling me. "She might have gone to the house," the detective said, and I heard her moving quickly, radio chatter in the background. "We have units watching, but they're positioned for external approach. If she went in through the back, stay by your phone." 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Detective Morrison, her voice tight and urgent. "Vanessa, your mother is being transported to County General. She's alive but unconscious. Frank's in custody. I need you to get to the hospital now." The drive was a blur of streetlights and fear. At the hospital, Detective Morrison met me in the emergency department waiting room and explained what their surveillance teams had witnessed. Frank had arrived at the house at 2 a.m, parking a block away and approaching on foot. The officers watched him enter through the front door, using his key, carrying a duffel bag. Through windows, they could see him moving through the rooms with a flashlight, entering the garage, then returning to the main house with containers. Margaret had apparently been unable to sleep, worried about family photograph albums she'd forgotten in the attic. Irreplaceable images of Lily's childhood. And I realized later, photos of Robert, my father, that she'd hidden away decades ago. She'd driven over around 2:30, parked down the street, and entered through the back door using her key, trying not to disturb anything, since she didn't know if Frank might be there. The surveillance audio picked up the moment she came down the attic stairs and saw Frank in the living room pouring gasoline along the baseboards. Her scream was captured clearly on the recording Detective Morrison would later play for me in her office, a sound of pure horror and betrayal. "Frank! What are you doing? Oh my God, what are you doing?" Frank had spun around, his face visible in the flashlight beam, twisted with shock and rage. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at Vanessa's. You're not supposed to be here." "I came for the photos, the albums from the attic. Frank, stop this. Stop it right now." Margaret's voice was high and panicked, and the surveillance team was already moving, radioing for backup, preparing to breach. But it happened too fast. The audio caught Frank shouting, "Give me your phone, give it to me!" Margaret must have been trying to call for help. There were sounds of struggle, Margaret crying, "No, Frank, no!" Then a crash, a thud, and Margaret's voice cutting off into terrible silence. The officers breached the front door within 30 seconds, but by then Margaret was lying unconscious on the floor, blood pooling beneath her head from where she'd struck the corner of the stone fireplace. Frank stood over her, the gasoline containers at his feet, looking between his wife's body and a box of matches in his hand. One officer would later testify that he heard Frank say clearly and distinctly, "I'm sorry, Maggie, but it's too late now. It has to look like an accident." Frank had actually started to light a match when the officers tackled him, shouting commands, wrestling him to the ground while he fought and screamed that they were trespassing, that this was his house, that they had no right. EMTs arrived within minutes and stabilized Margaret. Severe head trauma, possible skull fracture, unconscious and unresponsive. They transported her with lights and sirens while Frank was handcuffed, read his rights, and placed in the back of a patrol car. The small flame he'd managed to light before being tackled had caught on some newspaper, but officers extinguished it immediately. The house reeked of gasoline but stood intact, preserved as a crime scene. I sat in the hospital waiting room for 18 hours while Margaret underwent emergency surgery to relieve pressure on her brain. The neurosurgeon, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, explained that Margaret had fractured her skull and sustained significant bleeding, but they'd managed to stop it. "The next 48 hours are critical," she said. "If she wakes up, if there's no infection, if the swelling stays controlled, she should recover. But it's too early to know if there will be cognitive effects." When Margaret finally opened her eyes, disoriented and in pain, Detective Morrison was at her bedside. I watched through the window as the detective leaned close and asked Margaret what she remembered. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, but the detective's expression went hard and cold as she listened. When she came out, she met my eyes and said, her first coherent statement was, "He knew I was there. He saw me on the floor. He was going to light the match anyway. He was going to let me burn." My phone rang an hour later. It was Lily, her voice ragged with crying. "Vanessa, the police called me. They told me to come to the station, that I need to bring an attorney, that Dad's been arrested for trying to kill Mom. This can't be real. Please tell me this isn't real. I swear I didn't know about any of this. I swear. You have to believe me." I closed my eyes, exhausted beyond measure. "Lily, I believe you. Come to the hospital. Mom's alive. We can talk when you get here." Detective Morrison found me in the cafeteria an hour later, holding a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. She sat down across from me and slid a folder across the table. "The preliminary report," she said quietly. "Attempted murder, 2 counts, Margaret Sullivan and the responding officers who were endangered by the attempted arson. Arson in the 1st degree, insurance fraud, conspiracy. The evidence is overwhelming. Frank Sullivan isn't getting out of jail, Vanessa. Not for a very long time." The news of Frank's arrest hit the local paper within 24 hours, and by the end of the week, everyone in town knew the basic facts: attempted murder. Arson, a decades-long pattern of abuse and control. The headline read, local man arrested after attempting to kill wife in insurance fraud scheme. And suddenly the whispered conversations about me changed tone completely. People who'd looked at me with suspicion after I served the eviction notice now looked at me with something closer to respect, even admiration. I first noticed the shift at the grocery store 3 days after Frank's arrest. Mrs. Patterson, who'd always been kind, stopped me in the produce section with tears in her eyes. "Vanessa dear, I owe you an apology. Some of us were confused when we heard about the eviction notice, thought maybe you were being harsh. But now we understand you were protecting yourself and your mother from someone truly dangerous. I'm so sorry we doubted you." An elderly man I barely knew approached me at the checkout line. "My daughter left her husband after 20 years of him controlling every dollar, every decision," he said quietly. "It took her 5 years to build up the courage. What you did standing up to that man, you probably saved your mother's life. You did the right thing." His voice cracked and he squeezed my hand before walking away. At church that Sunday, Pastor Michael mentioned during announcements that Margaret Sullivan was recovering from injuries and asked for prayers and practical support. Within an hour, there was a meal train organized online with every slot filled for the next 6 weeks. Women I'd known for years, but who'd kept their distance, came up to me after the service sharing their own stories in hushed voices. One woman told me about her father who'd isolated her mother for 40 years. Another described a brother who'd financially exploited their elderly parents. "It takes courage to name abuse," one woman said, "especially when it's family. Thank you for showing us that boundaries aren't betrayal." The fire chief Tom Reynolds found me after church and asked if he could say something publicly. I nodded, not sure what he meant, and he stood up during coffee hour and addressed the room. "I want everyone to know that 5 years ago, Vanessa Sullivan made an anonymous donation that allowed our department to purchase new thermal imaging equipment and updated breathing apparatus. That equipment was used the night we responded to the incident at Maple Drive. The officers who entered that house to save Margaret Sullivan had the tools they needed because of Vanessa's generosity years ago. She's been serving this community quietly for a long time." The room burst into applause, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment, and something that felt almost like vindication. Margaret spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from her skull fracture and the surgery to relieve the pressure on her brain. Her cognitive functions returned gradually, and the neurologist was cautiously optimistic that she'd make a full recovery. During her 2nd week, James Chen visited her hospital room with divorce papers prepared through his firm's pro bono domestic violence services. "I want to do this," Margaret said, her voice still weak but determined. "I need to do this." She signed the papers with a shaking hand, and then she did something I hadn't expected. She recorded a video statement to be filed with the court and potentially used in Frank's criminal trial. I watched the recording later. Margaret sat propped up in her hospital bed, bruises still visible on her face, and spoke directly to the camera. "My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I've been married to Frank Sullivan for 37 years. For 37 years, he has controlled every aspect of my life through threats, manipulation, and coercion. He forced me to hide my daughter's true parentage and to treat her as less than family to maintain his facade. He threatened to take my children if I didn't comply. He isolated me from anyone who might have helped me see clearly." Her voice strengthened. "I let him control me. I let him hurt my daughter, Vanessa. I was so afraid of being alone, so afraid of judgment, that I sacrificed my own child's well-being. But that ends now. I'm filing for divorce. I'm supporting the criminal prosecution. And I'm asking the court to ensure that Frank Sullivan never has the opportunity to contact me or my daughter Vanessa again." The divorce filing included comprehensive restraining orders and a request that all marital assets be frozen pending investigation of Frank's insurance fraud and financial crimes. Margaret was finally, after decades, choosing herself and her daughter over fear. Lily's situation was more complicated. Detective Morrison had brought her in for questioning 2 days after Frank's arrest, and Lily had arrived with a public defender who specialized in white-collar crime. I wasn't present for the interview, but the detective told me later that Lily had been completely cooperative, providing full access to her phone, laptop, and email accounts without requiring a warrant. The evidence painted a picture of a young woman who'd been manipulated into financial crimes by both her father and her husband, but who'd had no knowledge whatsoever of the arson plot. The emails showed Lily's involvement in the fraud scheme with Ethan, the shell companies, the inflated invoices, all of it documented in her own words. But there was nothing about the fire, no mention of insurance fraud related to the house, no indication she knew her father was planning to commit murder. The most significant discovery was an unsent draft email on Lily's laptop dated 1 week before her wedding. The prosecutor showed it to me in her office, asking if I wanted to read it before they decided how to handle Lily's case. The email was addressed to Ethan. "I can't do this anymore. I keep thinking about Vanessa and how she's always been there for this family, even when we treated her like garbage. What we're doing to her company is wrong. Dad says she's too stupid to notice, but I don't think that's true. I think she's just trusting, and we're betraying that trust. I want to stop. I want to come clean. Maybe if we confess and pay the money back, she'll understand. She's always been more forgiving than we deserved." Lily had never sent the email. When questioned about it, she'd broken down crying and said she'd been too afraid of disappointing Frank, afraid of Ethan's anger, afraid of being cast out of the only family structure she'd ever known. The prosecutor had offered Lily full immunity from the fraud charges in exchange for her complete cooperation and testimony against both Frank and Ethan. "She's a victim too," the prosecutor had told me. "Maybe not to the extent your mother was, but she was raised in a toxic environment and manipulated by the two men who should have protected her. We want the architects of these schemes, not the tools they used." I'd agreed, though it wasn't really my decision to make. Justice didn't require Lily's destruction, it required accountability from the men who'd engineered these crimes. 3 weeks after Frank's arrest on a rainy Thursday evening, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Lily standing there, soaked through mascara running down her cheeks, carrying a small suitcase. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, diminished and afraid. "I have nowhere else to go," she said, her voice breaking. "Ethan's been arrested. Dad's in jail. Mom's still recovering, and I can't face her after what I did. I know I don't deserve your help, but I'm asking anyway. And there's something about our family you need to know. Something I just found out. Please, Vanessa, please." I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at my sister dripping rainwater onto my welcome mat, her eyes red and desperate. Every instinct told me to protect myself, to keep my boundaries firm, to remember the cruelty and the betrayal. But I also saw something I'd never seen before in Lily's face, genuine fear and vulnerability stripped of all performance. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "You're soaked through." I gave her a towel and made tea while she changed into dry clothes in my bathroom, emerging in sweatpants and an old college sweatshirt, looking younger than her 35 years. We sat in my living room, the rain drumming against the windows, and for several minutes neither of us spoke. Finally, Lily wrapped her hands around the warm mug and began to talk. "I knew about Ethan's fraud," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I signed papers for those shell companies. I helped him set up the invoicing structure. The prosecutor showed me all the emails, and I couldn't deny any of it because it was all true." She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "But I need you to understand how it started, how Dad got me into this." She explained that Frank had been coaching her since childhood, with a very specific message: she was his only real daughter, the biological child, the one who mattered. Vanessa was charity temporary, someone they could discard whenever they chose. "He told me that your adoption could be reversed if you ever got too demanding or ungrateful," Lily said. "He said you were here because we were generous, not because you belonged. And he made it clear that my job was to remind you of your place." The wedding comment hadn't been spontaneous cruelty, she confessed. 2 days before the ceremony, Frank had pulled her aside and given her explicit instructions. "He told me to put you in your place publicly in front of witnesses so everyone would see you weren't real family. He said once people understood you were just adopted, nobody would question it when we took the house back and you had no claim to anything. He coached me on exactly what to say. I felt sick hearing this understanding that the sister I'd resented for years had been as much a puppet as I'd been a victim. "Why didn't you refuse?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Because he said if I didn't do exactly what he wanted, if I wasn't perfect, he'd tell everyone that Mom had cheated on him and that I wasn't even his real daughter." Her voice broke completely. "He'd say it when he was angry when I got a B instead of an A, when I gained weight, when I dated someone he didn't approve of. 'You're lucky I claim you as mine,' he'd say. I could tell everyone the truth anytime I want." I thought he was just being cruel, trying to control me. I didn't think there was any truth to it. She pulled her phone from her bag with shaking hands and opened her email drafts. "This is what I wrote a week before my wedding. I never sent it because I was too scared." She handed me the phone, and I read the unsent message to Ethan, the one the prosecutor had shown me where Lily had wanted to stop the fraud, wanted to confess, called me more forgiving than they deserved. "I was drowning in guilt," Lily said. "But I was more afraid of losing everything, Dad's approval, my place in the family, the only identity I'd ever known. So I deleted the email and went through with the wedding and kept my mouth shut." She wiped her eyes roughly. "And then Dad tried to kill Mom, and I realized that everything I thought I knew was built on lies." She reached into her small suitcase and pulled out a wrinkled manila envelope, the paper soft with age. "Last night, before the police completely sealed the house, I was allowed to get some personal items. I was going through Mom's dresser looking for some jewelry she'd asked me to bring to the hospital, and I found this hidden under the lining paper in the bottom drawer. It's addressed to Mom in handwriting I don't recognize." I took the envelope carefully. The return address had been torn off, but the postmark was from 1992. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a medical report from County General Hospital, dated March 1992, patient name Frank Sullivan. The diagnosis section included the phrase, "complete azoospermia secondary to childhood mumps or chitis," and a note from the physician, "patient counseled regarding permanent infertility, sperm count 0, no viable sperm present, condition irreversible." Patient expressed significant emotional distress regarding inability to father biological children. Frank had been completely sterile since childhood. He could never have biological children. The second document was a letter on letterhead from a fertility clinic addressed to Margaret Sullivan, dated August 1989. I read it twice, my hands trembling. "Dear Mrs. Sullivan, following our consultation regarding alternative insemination options, I want to reiterate that the decision to pursue donor insemination is entirely yours and should be made free from coercion. You expressed concerns during our appointment that your husband is pressuring you to conceive and that you fear his reaction if the resulting child is not biologically his. Please know that our clinic offers counseling services and that you are under no obligation to proceed with any treatment you're uncomfortable with. If you choose to move forward, we will work with you to select an appropriate donor and ensure complete confidentiality." I looked up at Lily, who was watching my face with an expression of dawning horror. "He was sterile," I said slowly. "Frank couldn't have biological children, which means I'm not his daughter either." Lily finished, her voice hollow. "He pressured Mom to get pregnant with a donor. She did it, but Frank resented me from the moment I was born because I was a girl instead of the son he wanted, and because I was constant proof that another man's genetics were in his house, that he couldn't actually father children." The room felt like it was tilting. We sat there, 2 women who'd spent their entire lives defined by a man's lies, staring at documents that proved neither of us belonged to him at all. I wasn't the adopted charity case. Lily wasn't the precious biological daughter. We were both products of Margaret's choices made under duress, both raised in a household where Frank controlled the narrative about who we were and what we deserved. "He made us hate each other," Lily whispered. "He taught me to look down on you, taught you to envy me, kept us divided so we'd never compare notes and figure out that neither of us was what he claimed. We spent 37 years competing for the love of a man who was biologically incapable of being either of our fathers." I reached across the space between us and took my sister's hand. "If you're not adopted and I'm not his," Lily said, her voice shaking, "then who are we? And what else did he lie about?" The next morning, Lily and I went to the hospital together. Margaret had been moved from intensive care to a regular room, and the doctors said her recovery was progressing better than expected. When we walked in carrying the fertility documents and the clinic letter, Margaret took one look at our unified front and her face crumpled. "You found them," she said, not a question, but a statement of inevitable truth. We sat on either side of her hospital bed, and I held the medical report where she could see it. "Mom, we need you to tell us everything. No more secrets. No more protecting Frank or protecting us from the truth. We deserve to know who we really are." Margaret closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "You're right. You've always deserved the truth, both of you. I was just too much of a coward to give it to you." She adjusted herself slightly in the bed, wincing from the pain. "After Frank forced me to pretend Vanessa was adopted after he made me seal those court records and erase Robert from our lives, he became obsessed with having his own child. A son, specifically. He wanted to prove his masculinity, his legacy, all the things Robert's death had stolen from him." She explained that about a year after they married, Frank had started pressuring her to get pregnant. When months passed without conception, he insisted they both get fertility testing. The results devastated him: complete sterility from a childhood case of mumps that had caused permanent damage. "He raged for weeks," Margaret said quietly. "Broke things, screamed at me like it was somehow my fault. Then he came up with his solution: I would conceive with a sperm donor, but he would choose the donor, control the entire process, and we would never tell anyone. The child would be his in every legal sense, and I was forbidden from ever acknowledging the truth." Lily's hand found mine across the bed, both of us bracing for what came next. "Frank went through his business contacts and selected Dr. Marcus Chen," Margaret continued. "Marcus was a pediatrician, highly educated, successful, everything Frank wanted to claim as his own genetics. Marcus had agreed to anonymous sperm donation to help couples struggling with infertility. He never met me. He doesn't know you exist, Lily. The clinic handled everything clinically artificially. Frank made sure there was no possibility of any emotional connection or future claim." "Why did he treat me so badly if I was what he wanted?" Lily asked, her voice breaking. Margaret reached for Lily's face with her uninjured hand. "Because you were a girl, sweetheart. Frank wanted a son to carry on his name, his legacy. When you were born female, he felt betrayed by fate or God or me, I was never sure which. And you were living proof of his inadequacy, his inability to father children himself. Every time he looked at you, he saw another man's DNA thriving while his own genetic line ended. So he took out his resentment on you through impossible standards, constant criticism, and withholding the love you deserved." I thought about all those years of Lily being told she was the precious biological daughter while I was the disposable adopted one. The entire hierarchy had been a lie designed to keep us both under Frank's control through different forms of psychological torture. "Do you have any information about Dr. Chen?" I asked. "Does Lily have a right to know him?" Margaret nodded and reached for her bedside table, pulling out her phone. She scrolled through her photos and found an image she'd apparently kept hidden for years, a scanned page from an old medical directory showing a professional headshot. Dr. Marcus Chen looked to be in his late 30s in the photo, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle smile. "He specialized in pediatric care," Margaret said. "He retired about 5 years ago. Frank chose him because he was intelligent and accomplished, but Frank hated the thought of me feeling any gratitude toward Marcus even though I'd never met him. That's part of why Frank treated Lily so cruelly. He was punishing both of us for the existence of another man in our family tree." Lily stared at the photo of the man who was biologically her father, tears streaming silently down her face. "He looks kind," she whispered. "He was known for being compassionate with children and families," Margaret said. "Everything I heard about him suggested he was a good man who genuinely wanted to help people." Nothing like Frank. The three of us sat in that hospital room as the full picture finally came into focus. Frank had built an entire family structure on lies and coercion. He'd forced Margaret to hide my true parentage, then forced her to conceive Lily through a donor he selected and controlled. He'd created a false hierarchy where I was the adopted charity case and Lily was the treasured biological daughter, when in reality neither of us had any genetic connection to him whatsoever. The competition he'd engineered between us, the cruelty he'd encouraged, the division he'd maintained, all of it served to keep us weak, separated, and under his control. "I'm so sorry," Lily said, looking at me across Margaret's bed. "I'm so sorry for every cruel thing I said, every time I made you feel less than, every moment I participated in his lies. I thought I was the real daughter and you were the outsider, but we were both just tools he used against each other." "We were both his victims," I said, squeezing her hand. "You were programmed to hurt me from childhood. That's not your fault. That's his." "But I'm an adult now," Lily insisted. "I should have questioned it. I should have seen through it. I'm responsible for my own actions even if he planted the ideas." "You're right," I said, and she flinched slightly. "You are responsible. But you're also here now being honest, trying to make it right. That matters. We were both trapped in his story. But we don't have to keep being his story. We can write a new one." Margaret sobbed, openly reaching for both of us. "I let him control all of us. I was so afraid of losing my children, afraid of judgment, afraid of being alone. I sacrificed both of you to my fear. I'm so sorry." We held each other across that hospital bed, three women who'd been systematically isolated and manipulated by one man's need for control, finally united in truth, even if it came decades too late. The lies that had shaped our entire family were finally exposed, and in their absence we could begin to see each other clearly for the first time. Margaret pulled back after a few minutes and reached under her pillow, withdrawing another envelope, this one with a business card clipped to it. "There's one more person you need to meet, Vanessa," she said, handing it to me. "He's been looking for you for over 30 years. Your father Robert had a younger brother, James. He's been trying to find you since Robert died. Frank blocked every attempt, threatened legal action, kept him away. But you deserve to know your father's family. You deserve to know you were wanted." I held the business card in my hand like it was made of something more precious than paper. James Sullivan, attorney at law with a specialty in family rights and domestic violence cases. The address was local, less than 20 miles from where I lived. My father's brother had been this close for 37 years, and I'd never known he existed. "He tried to find you so many times," Margaret said, her voice thick with regret. "He hired investigators after Robert died, tracked us down when you were just a baby. He wanted to be part of your life, wanted to honor his brother's memory by knowing his daughter. But Frank threatened him with restraining orders, accused him of harassment, told him that if he ever came near us, he'd have him arrested and disbarred. James sent letters anyway, birthday cards every year addressed to you. Frank intercepted every single one." My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. It was 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening, probably too late to call a professional number, but I couldn't wait. I dialed, and the phone rang twice before a man's voice answered, cautious and professional. "James Sullivan?" "My name is Vanessa Sullivan," I said, my voice barely steady. "And I think you might be my uncle." There was a sharp intake of breath, then silence that stretched so long I thought the connection had dropped. Finally, his voice came back broken and full of emotion. "Vanessa, oh my God, Vanessa, I've been looking for you for over 30 years. We met the next afternoon at a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. I recognized him the moment he walked in, even though I'd never seen a photo of him before. He had my eyes. Or rather, I had his, the same deep brown, the same slight downturn at the outer corners. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired and distinguished in a way that suggested quiet competence rather than showiness. When he saw me, his face transformed with an emotion I couldn't quite name, something between joy and grief and relief. He was carrying a medium-sized cardboard box, which he set on the table between us after we'd awkwardly embraced. "I brought everything I have of your father's," he said. "I've been keeping it safe, hoping that someday I'd get to give it to you." Inside the box were treasures I hadn't known existed. Leather-bound journals in my father's handwriting detailing cases he'd worked on, thoughts about justice and fairness, and pages about Margaret. How he'd met her when her abusive family had hired him to draft financial documents for a trust. How he'd fallen in love with her gentle spirit and fierce determination to escape her circumstances. How he wanted to build a life with her that was everything her childhood hadn't been. There were photographs of Robert and Margaret together, young and genuinely happy, in a way I'd never seen Margaret look with Frank. In these pictures, Margaret was radiant, unguarded, her smile reaching her eyes. Robert looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. And there was a small velvet box containing an engagement ring, simple and elegant, that Robert had bought 2 weeks before he died. "He was going to propose on New Year's Eve," James said quietly. "He had it all planned. He'd already started a college fund for the baby. He was so excited to be a father, Vanessa. He wrote about you constantly, even though you weren't born yet." James showed me journal entries from the months before my birth. "I felt the baby kick today through Margaret's belly. My daughter. My daughter is already fighting to be known. I'm going to make sure she has every opportunity, every chance to become whoever she wants to be. I'm starting her college fund tomorrow. She's going to study whatever calls to her heart, law, maybe, if she inherits my sense of justice, or art, if she gets her mother's creativity, or business, if she wants to build empires. Whatever she chooses, she'll know she was wanted and loved before she even took her first breath." Tears were streaming down my face. "He died before I was born," I managed to say. "Car accident," James confirmed. "Drunk driver ran a red light. Robert was on his way home from a late meeting at the firm. He died instantly. I was 28, still in law school, and my big brother was just gone." He paused, collecting himself. "I tried everything to reach you and Margaret. I hired investigators, sent letters, even showed up at the house once when you were about 3 years old. Frank answered the door and told me that if I ever came back, he'd have me arrested for stalking and file complaints with the Bar Association that would end my career before it started. I was young and scared, so I backed off. But I kept the college fund going. I converted it into an anonymous merit scholarship through the University Foundation when you were in high school." My breath caught. "The full-ride scholarship I got. That was you." "That was your father," James corrected gently. "That was Robert's money, Robert's dream for you. I just made sure it got to you despite Frank's interference." He explained that he'd been following my life from a distance, learning about my business success, reading about the recent court case and Frank's arrest. "When I saw your name in the paper connected to the assault and arson charges, I knew it was finally time. Frank can't threaten me anymore, and you deserve to know your father's family." He offered to represent Margaret and me in the criminal prosecution pro bono, specializing as he did in family rights and domestic violence. "Not because you need me," he said. "You've clearly built an incredible life and you're more than capable, but because it's what Robert would have wanted. Let me help you finish what my brother started, protecting your mother and you from men who abuse power and control." I accepted, feeling pieces of myself clicking into place that I hadn't known were missing. "There's also the matter of Robert's estate," James said. "It wasn't much, he was a young attorney just building his practice. But there's been a trust account in your name since 1988. About $150,000 after funding your scholarship and years of compound interest. It's yours. It always has been." I was overwhelmed trying to process that I had family who'd been fighting for me, protecting me, loving me from a distance for my entire life. James reached into the box one more time and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the table, and I found myself looking at my father, young, happy, holding what appeared to be an ultrasound image. "This was Robert with your first ultrasound picture," James said softly. "He carried it in his wallet everywhere. You were loved before you were even born, Vanessa. Never doubt that." James took over as lead counsel for both Margaret and me within days of our meeting, coordinating closely with the district attorney's office to ensure Frank faced the full weight of justice. The arraignment happened 2 weeks after Frank's arrest, and James insisted I attend to witness the process firsthand. "You need to see that the system can work," he said. "Not perfectly, not always, but in this case with this evidence it will work." The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, from television dramas with fluorescent lighting and worn wooden benches. Frank was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, looking diminished and older than I remembered. He didn't look at me or Margaret, who sat beside me in the gallery, her head still bandaged but her spine straight. The charges were read aloud by the clerk: 2 counts of attempted murder in the first degree, 1 count of arson, in the first-degree conspiracy to commit insurance fraud and coercive control under the state's relatively new domestic violence statutes. Frank's public defender, a harried-looking woman who'd clearly drawn the short straw on this case, entered a plea of not guilty on all counts. The bail hearing followed immediately. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Catherine Rodriguez who specialized in violent crimes, presented the case methodically. She detailed Frank's decades of controlling behavior, the premeditated nature of the arson plan, the flight risk indicators, including inquiries Frank had made about property in the Cayman Islands 6 months prior, and the frozen bank accounts that showed suspicious transfers totaling nearly $300,000 to offshore holdings. Frank's attorney argued weakly for reasonable bail, citing his age, his ties to the community, and his lack of prior criminal record. James stood and requested permission to address the court as counsel for the victims. He presented Margaret's medical records, the security footage showing Frank preparing to light the match even after seeing Margaret unconscious, and the life insurance policies that demonstrated financial motive for murder. Judge Patricia Williams, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and no tolerance for nonsense, reviewed the materials with pursed lips. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, looking directly at Frank, "the evidence suggests you planned and attempted to execute the murder of your wife for financial gain, endangered law enforcement officers in the commission of that crime, and have the means and apparent will to flee prosecution. Bail is set at $500,000 cash." She brought down her gavel with a sharp crack. Frank's face went pale. With his accounts frozen, there was no way he could make bail. He was remanded to county jail to await trial, and as the bailiff led him away, he finally looked at me. I met his gaze steadily, my hands relaxed in my lap, feeling nothing but the quiet satisfaction of watching justice proceed through proper channels rather than revenge. Ethan's case moved faster. Facing 8 to 10 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy, he took a plea deal within 3 weeks of Frank's arraignment. His attorney negotiated a reduced sentence of 5 years in exchange for complete cooperation and testimony against Frank. I wasn't present for Ethan's formal plea hearing, but James provided me with transcripts of his statement to prosecutors. Ethan had thrown Frank completely under the bus in an attempt to save himself. He detailed conversations where Frank had explicitly discussed sharing the insurance payout from the burned house, confirmed that Frank had been the architect of the entire fraud scheme, and provided the most damning testimony of all Frank had said during one planning session. "If Margaret happens to be in the house when it goes up, that's another $2 million from her life insurance. We make sure she's inside." The transcript made me physically ill, seeing in black and white that Frank had actively planned my mother's murder for money. Lily, who read the same transcript at the prosecutor's office, had called me afterward, her voice hollow. "I married a man who was willing to let my mother burn to death for a cut of insurance money," she'd said. "How did I not see who he was?" "Because he showed you the version of himself he wanted you to see," I'd told her. "Like Frank did to all of us." Lily filed for divorce from Ethan, immediately citing fraud, conspiracy, and irreconcilable differences. She wanted nothing from the marriage, no assets, no settlement, just a clean legal separation from a man who'd used her as a pawn in criminal schemes. The corporate side of the case resolved separately. My company's board of directors, after reviewing the complete audit findings and consulting with legal counsel, made several decisions. They would not prosecute Lily, recognizing her cooperation and the coercive environment she'd been raised in. However, they terminated all contracts with Cole Logistics Solutions immediately and filed a civil lawsuit to recover the approximately $400,000 in fraudulent payments. Ethan's company, already damaged by his criminal charges and the loss of its major contracts, collapsed within a month. He had no assets to satisfy the judgment. The lawsuit would follow him for years, a financial shadow he'd never escape even after serving his prison sentence. My company also issued a public statement that James helped draft. Meridian Supply Corporation commends Vanessa Sullivan for identifying potential fraud involving family members and reporting it immediately according to company protocol and legal requirements. Her actions demonstrate the integrity and ethical standards we expect from all employees and leadership. Ms. Sullivan has been cleared of any wrongdoing and continues in her position with our full confidence and support. That statement, published in the business section of the regional paper and posted on the company website, mattered more than I'd expected. In my professional community, reputation is everything, and having my integrity publicly affirmed by my own company after turning in family members was a vindication that reached beyond the courtroom. 2 months after Frank's arraignment, James met with Catherine Rodriguez to review the prosecution's case strategy. He called me afterward, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. Catherine says with Ethan's testimony, the security footage, the insurance policies, and Margaret's statement, they're confident they'll get a conviction. Frank Sullivan is looking at 25 years to life. At 65 years old, that's effectively a life sentence. He'll die in prison, Vanessa. With Frank's criminal case moving forward and the evidence of his fraud thoroughly documented, there remained one final legal question to resolve: who actually owned the property at 847 Maple Drive. The house itself had been damaged in the arson attempt, though not destroyed, and stood empty as a crime scene for weeks before being released back to me. James filed a motion for declaratory judgment, asking the court to formally establish ownership beyond any possible challenge. The hearing took place on a crisp November morning, 3 months after Frank's arrest. James presented the loan purchase documents from 2 years prior, showing I'd bought Frank's debt from the bank and become the legal owner. He presented the occupancy agreement with Frank's own signature, acknowledging my ownership. And he presented the unsealed adoption records, proving that any claims Frank might make about me being an adopted interloper were fraudulent fabrications designed to control and manipulate. Judge Williams, the same judge who'd presided over Frank's bail hearing, reviewed the documents with the thoroughness I'd come to expect from her. "The evidence is clear and convincing," she said. "Vanessa Sullivan is the sole legal owner of the property at 847 Maple Drive and has been since October 2022. Any claims to the contrary based on familial status or adoption narratives are without merit and are hereby dismissed." She looked up at me over her reading glasses. "Ms. Sullivan, the court commends you for your restraint and proper use of legal channels throughout this difficult situation. You could have simply evicted your parents summarily, but instead you offered mediation support and every opportunity for reconciliation. That speaks well of your character." Her statement made the local newspaper's next edition, "Judge Commends Local Woman's Integrity in Family Property Dispute." The article circulated through town, and I felt the last whispers of judgment finally fade away, replaced by something closer to respect. I visited the property alone on a gray afternoon in late November, standing where the living room had once been. The foundation remained intact, blackened by smoke and water damage. The frame stood partially a skeleton of what had been. I could have sold the land easily. The lot alone was worth $300,000 in this neighborhood. I could have rebuilt the house for myself, erased the memories with new walls and fresh paint. Instead, I stood there and thought about the biblical verse Uncle James had shown me in Robert's Bible, a passage my father had underlined and annotated. "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Beside it, in Robert's handwriting, was a note, Those who are dismissed, excluded, treated as less than, they become the foundation for something stronger than what rejected them. I pulled out my phone and called James. "I want to donate the property to establish a non-profit," I said. "A transitional housing and support center for women escaping family abuse, coercive control, financial manipulation. I want to call it Cornerstone House." There was a moment of silence, then James's voice came back thick with emotion. "Robert would be so proud. I'm proud. Let's make it happen." The announcement went public 2 weeks later through a carefully worded press release and a town hall meeting I held at the church. I explained my vision. Cornerstone House would provide temporary housing for women and their children fleeing abusive situations, offering 6 private apartment units, a communal kitchen, a children's play area, and offices for free legal consultation, financial literacy classes, and therapy services. The building would rise from the ashes of my family home, transforming a place of control and lies into a place of safety and truth. The response overwhelmed me. Local contractors who'd known me for years offered labor at cost. The church pledged to run fundraising campaigns and provide volunteer support. Former clients from my business career sent donations ranging from a few hundred to several $1,000s. Even some relatives who'd laughed at Lily's wedding comment sent checks with handwritten notes. "We're sorry, we should have known better. We should have supported you." The town newspaper ran a feature story with my photo standing on the property titled, "From Humiliation to Hope, Local Woman Turns Pain into Purpose." The article detailed the wedding incident, the subsequent revelations about Frank's abuse and fraud, and my decision to build something healing from something broken. But it was the private conversations that meant the most. Older women from church and the community sought me out quietly in grocery store aisles and coffee shop corners to tell me their own stories. A 70-year-old woman named Dorothy told me about spending 40 years with a husband who controlled every penny and decision. "If Cornerstone House had existed when I was young enough to leave, my whole life would have been different," she said, gripping my hands. "You're giving other women the chance I never had." Another woman, Eleanor, shared how her son had financially exploited her for years, and she'd had nowhere to turn for help understanding her legal rights. "Women my age, we were raised to keep family problems private to make it work no matter what. A place that says you can get help, you can leave, you deserve safety, that would have saved me decades of pain." This validation from my target demographic, women who'd lived through eras when leaving wasn't an option and speaking up wasn't acceptable, felt like the truest victory of all. I wasn't just building a facility. I was building a statement that boundaries aren't betrayal and that choosing yourself isn't selfish. I sat in my apartment on a December evening signing the final non-profit incorporation papers that James had prepared when my phone buzzed with an alert I'd almost forgotten I'd set up. The DNA Ancestry Service notification flashed across my screen. "DNA match alert. Possible 50% match located. Click to view details." My hand froze over the signature line, my heart suddenly pounding. A 50% match meant parent or child. Margaret was already in the system. This was someone else. Someone new. Someone I didn't know existed. I clicked on the notification with trembling fingers, my breath shallow as the profile loaded. Emma Charlotte Morrison, age 20, location, listed as a university town 2 hours north. The photograph showed a young woman with dark eyes that were unmistakably mine, the same slight downturn at the outer corners, the same intensity in her gaze. She was holding a textbook, and I could just make out the title, Social Justice and the Law. Her profile bio was brief. Junior studying social work and advocacy. Searching for my biological mother to understand my story and find missing pieces of my identity. My vision blurred with tears as 20 years of buried grief erupted all at once. I was 17 when I got pregnant, in the darkest period of Frank's control, when every aspect of my life was monitored and managed. The father was a boy named Michael from my high school, a sweet, gentle kid who played guitar and dreamed of teaching music. Frank had forbidden me from dating him because Michael's family wasn't our class. But we'd stolen moments together anyway. Desperate teenage rebellion that resulted in a consequence neither of us was prepared for. Margaret discovered the pregnancy when I was 3 months along, too sick to hide the morning sickness anymore. I remember her face going pale, her hands shaking as she told me we had to tell Frank immediately. His rage was cold and calculated rather than explosive. He sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that I would finish the pregnancy quietly, that he'd already contacted an adoption attorney, and that I would sign the papers immediately after birth. "This baby will go to a good family who can actually provide for it," he said, his voice flat. "You will never see it, never contact it, and never speak of this again. Do you understand?" I'd begged to keep the baby, promised I'd work, promised I'd do anything. Frank's response was to show me preliminary custody papers he'd already had drafted, claiming I was mentally unstable and unfit to parent, that both the baby and I would be removed from Margaret's care if I didn't cooperate. "Sign the adoption papers willingly, or I'll make sure you're declared incompetent, and the child goes into state foster care, where God knows what will happen," he said. "At least this way the baby goes to a stable home." I gave birth alone, Margaret not permitted in the delivery room per Frank's instructions. I held my daughter for less than 5 minutes before a social worker took her away. I remember her tiny fingers, her serious eyes that seemed to look right through me, the weight of her in my arms that felt both impossibly light and unbearably heavy. I signed the papers in a hospital room, my hand shaking so badly I could barely write my name, and then she was gone. For 20 years I'd carried that loss like a stone in my chest, never speaking of it, never acknowledging it, burying it so deep that I could almost pretend it hadn't happened. Almost. Now I clicked through to Emma's full profile and found a button labeled Send Message. I typed slowly, choosing each word with the care of someone defusing a bomb. "My name is Vanessa Sullivan. I believe I may be the person you're looking for. I'd like to meet you if you're comfortable and answer any questions you have. I've thought about you every single day for 20 years. If you want to talk, I'm here." I hit send and then sat staring at my phone, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. 53 minutes later, a response appeared. "I've been looking for you for 3 years. I obtained my adoption records when I turned 18, but so much was sealed or redacted. The DNA test was my last hope. Yes, please. When can we meet?" I called Margaret immediately, my voice shaking as I explained. She cried, remembering how Frank had orchestrated everything, how he'd forbidden her from comforting me afterward, how she'd failed me in yet another crucial moment. "I wanted to help you keep her," Margaret sobbed. "But he said he'd have you both taken away. I was so scared. I'm so sorry." Lily, when I told her, went very quiet for a long moment. "I had a niece this whole time," she finally said. "One more person Frank erased from our family. One more way he controlled all of us." She squeezed my hand. "I'm so glad she found you. I'm so glad you get a chance to know her." James helped me gather documents showing the coercive circumstances of the adoption, Frank's custody threat papers, the timeline proving I was a minor under Frank's control, medical records showing I'd asked to keep the baby and been overruled. "Emma deserves to know this wasn't abandonment," James said. "This was theft. Frank stole your daughter from you." I chose a cafe near Emma's university neutral territory in daylight and sent her the address. We agreed on Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. I barely slept Friday night, lying awake imagining every possible scenario. What if she hated me for giving her up? What if she blamed me for not fighting harder? What if 20 years was too long and too much had been lost? What if she took one look at me and decided I wasn't worth knowing? Saturday morning, I changed clothes 4 times, unable to decide what a mother should wear to meet the daughter she gave away 2 decades ago. I settled on simple jeans and a sweater, trying to look approachable rather than intimidating. I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early and ordered tea. I didn't drink, my hands too unsteady to lift the cup. At 1:58, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma's number. I'm here. I'm at the corner table by the window. I'm wearing a blue sweater. I'm ready to meet you, Mom." The word "Mom" broke something open in my chest. I stood up, my legs shaking, and turned toward the window. There she was, sitting at the corner table by the window, backlit by the winter afternoon sun. Emma looked up as I approached, and I saw my own face 20 years younger, mixed with something that must have come from her father Michael, a softness around the mouth, a gentle quality to her expression. But the eyes were unmistakably mine, and when she smiled tentatively, I saw Robert's nose from the photographs Uncle James had shown me, that same slightly upturned shape that made smiles look a little mischievous. We stood awkwardly for a moment, then moved into a hug that started careful and uncertain, but quickly became tight and desperate. She was taller than me by an inch, and she smelled like vanilla and coffee and hope. When we finally pulled apart, we were both crying. "I don't even know what to say," I admitted, sliding into the seat across from her. "Me neither," Emma said, laughing through tears. "I've practiced this conversation in my head 1,000 times, and now all my scripts are gone." So we just started talking haltingly at first, and then with increasing ease as the hours passed. Emma told me about her childhood with her adoptive family, the Morrisons, who lived in a suburb an hour north. "They were fine," she said carefully. "Not abusive or cruel, just distant. They told me from the beginning that I was adopted, that my biological mother was a troubled teenager who'd given me up and never looked back. They said I should be grateful they took me in and gave me opportunities you couldn't provide." But as Emma grew older, the story started to feel wrong. When she turned 18, she petitioned for her adoption records and found them full of redactions and sealed sections. The documents she could see showed signatures that looked shaky and uncertain, court orders that seemed designed to prevent any future contact, and references to family pressure and coercive circumstances that weren't explained. "I became a social work major because I wanted to understand how systems fail vulnerable people, especially women," Emma said. "I wanted to know why adoption records get sealed, why families get separated, why some stories are told and others are buried." 3 months ago, she'd seen news coverage of my case, Frank's arrest, the revelations about decades of abuse and control, the upcoming trial. The name Sullivan had jumped out at her from the screen because it was on her birth certificate, the one piece of information that hadn't been redacted. "I took a DNA test the next day," she said. "I had to know if you were the same Sullivan. And when the match came back at 50%, I knew. I finally knew who you were." I reached across the table and took her hands. "Emma, I need you to understand what really happened. I was 17 years old and completely under Frank's control. I got pregnant, and he immediately arranged for adoption before I could even think about alternatives. I begged to keep you. I promised I'd work, I'd do anything. But Frank showed me legal papers claiming I was mentally unstable and unfit to parent. He said if I didn't sign the adoption papers willingly, he'd have both of us taken by the state, and you'd end up in foster care where terrible things would happen." My voice cracked, but I forced myself to continue. "I held you for less than 5 minutes after you were born. You had these serious eyes like you were trying to understand everything all at once. And then a social worker took you away, and I signed papers I barely read because I was terrified and exhausted, and Frank was standing over me saying this was the only way to keep you safe. I was told the adoption was best for you, that I was too young and too broken to be your mother. But I never stopped thinking about you. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone, I wondered where you were, and if you were happy, and if you'd ever want to know me." Emma's tears were flowing freely now. "I'm not angry," she said, squeezing my hands. "I'm relieved, because I always felt like the story didn't make sense, like there were pieces missing. And now I know the truth. You didn't abandon me. You were forced. There's a huge difference." We talked for another 2 hours, the cafe staff refilling our water glasses and politely ignoring our tear-stained faces. We agreed to take things slowly to build a relationship without pressure or forced intimacy. "You can call me Vanessa for now," I said. "If Mom ever feels right, we'll get there. But there's no rush." Emma nodded, then smiled. I graduate in May with a degree in social work and advocacy. I'm looking for internships and volunteer opportunities in the field. What exactly is Cornerstone House going to do? I explained my vision: the transitional housing, the legal services, the financial literacy programs, the therapy support. Emma's eyes lit up. My senior thesis was on transitional housing models for abuse survivors, she said. I analyzed 12 different programs across 6 states, looking at what made them successful and what barriers women faced in accessing services. I'd love to help with Cornerstone House if you need someone. Not because you're my biological mother, but because it's literally what I want to do with my career. We absolutely need help, I said, feeling pieces of my life clicking into place in ways I'd never imagined. But only if you want to be there. This isn't about pulling you into my life or creating obligations. It's about making space if you want it. I want it, Emma said simply. Before we left, we took a photo together, Emma's phone held at arm's length, both of us smiling through the remnants of tears. It wasn't a perfect photo. Our eyes were red, our hair was messy, the lighting was dim, but it was real. Emma sent it to me immediately, and I saved it as my phone wallpaper, replacing the generic landscape that had been there before. We hugged goodbye at the cafe door, promising to meet for dinner the following week. As I walked to my car feeling lighter than I had in 20 years, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking news: verdict reached in Sullivan arson murder trial. Frank Sullivan found guilty on all counts. I stood in the parking lot, phone in hand, staring at the news alert with a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite name. Relief, certainly. Vindication. But also a strange emptiness, the feeling that comes when a long battle finally ends and you realize you've been so focused on fighting that you're not sure what comes next. James called 30 seconds later. "You saw the news?" he asked. "Just now. Guilty on all counts. Every single one. The jury was out for 6 hours. Catherine said half of that was just paperwork and procedure. The actual deliberation took maybe 3 hours. The evidence was overwhelming." The sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks later. James had asked if I wanted to attend, and I'd said yes, needing to see this final chapter close in person. The courtroom was more crowded than during the arraignment, packed with reporters, community members, and people who'd followed the case. Margaret sat beside me, her hand in mine. Lily sat on my other side, her face pale but composed. Emma had offered to come for support, but I'd asked her to wait. There would be time for her to meet the rest of the family when this was truly over. Judge Williams called the court to order and asked if anyone wished to make victim impact statements. Margaret stood, her voice shaking but clear, and spoke about 37 years of living in fear of having her autonomy stolen, of watching her daughters suffer because she'd been too frightened to protect them. When she finished, she looked directly at Frank for the first time. "You tried to kill me. You almost succeeded. But I survived, and I'm free of you now. That's the only justice I need." The judge then turned to Frank, who stood in his orange jumpsuit, thinner and grayer than he'd been 6 months ago. She reviewed each count methodically before delivering her sentence. "Mr. Sullivan, you spent decades building a facade of respectability while systematically abusing and controlling the women in your family. You treated your wife and daughters as property to be managed, manipulated, and ultimately disposed of when they no longer served your purposes. You forced one daughter into an adoption narrative to hide your own inadequacies. You coerced your wife into conceiving a second daughter through donor insemination, then resented that child for not being the son you wanted. You manipulated both daughters against each other to maintain control, and when your control began to slip when Vanessa set boundaries, you could not tolerate. You planned and attempted to commit murder for financial gain." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. "This court's sentence reflects the severity of your crimes and the calculated cruelty with which you committed them. On count 1, attempted murder of Margaret Sullivan, I sentence you to 25 years to life. On count 2, attempted murder of law enforcement officers, I sentence you to 15 years to life to run consecutively. On the charge of arson in the first degree, 10 years. On conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, 5 years. On coercive control, the maximum sentence of 5 years. Total sentence 60 years, with no possibility of parole for 20 years. At 65 years old, Frank would be 85 before he could even be considered for parole. He would die in prison. The courtroom was silent as bailiffs led him away. He didn't look at any of us, didn't speak, just shuffled out with his head down. A diminished man who'd built his entire identity on control and lost everything when that control evaporated. Ethan's sentencing happened separately in federal court a week later. I didn't attend, but Lily did, wanting to see that chapter close with her own eyes. She called me afterward, her voice steady. 8 years in federal prison. Full restitution of $400,000 that he doesn't have and will probably never be able to pay. His business is gone, his reputation destroyed, his freedom taken. And I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, just relief that it's over. She'd filed for divorce the day after Frank's sentencing, and Ethan hadn't contested it. He had nothing left to fight for and no leverage left to use. The divorce would be final in 60 days, and Lily would be legally free of both the men who'd groomed her into participating in their schemes. 3 days after Ethan's sentencing, Lily did something I hadn't expected. She held a press conference, a small affair arranged through her attorney, and made a public statement that appeared in the local paper and on the evening news. I watched the video recording later, seeing my sister stand at a podium, looking both terrified and determined. I want to apologize publicly to my sister Vanessa for years of cruelty that I now understand was programmed into me by an abusive father, Lily said, reading from prepared notes but maintaining eye contact with the camera. Vanessa showed incredible courage in setting boundaries and refusing to enable our family's toxic patterns. She reported fraud even though it implicated family members, including me. She pursued justice through proper legal channels, even when it would have been easier to seek revenge or simply walk away. Lily's voice strengthened as she continued. I participated in financial fraud. I said cruel things. I participated in a family system that treated Vanessa as less than for her entire life. I was both a victim of manipulation and an active participant in harm. I'm working with a therapist to understand how both things can be true, and to take responsibility for my own actions, regardless of how I was raised. She looked directly into the camera. I'm committed to making amends through actions, not just words. I'm donating my share of any remaining family assets to Cornerstone House, the nonprofit Vanessa is founding, to help women escape exactly the kind of control our father inflicted on our family. I'll be volunteering my time there in whatever capacity Vanessa deems appropriate. I can't undo the past, but I can try to build a different future. After the press conference, Lily came to my apartment and we sat together on my couch, exhausted and wrung out. Thank you, I said quietly. For what? For being willing to say it publicly, for not hiding or making excuses. That took courage. I learned it from you, Lily said. You could have destroyed all of us quietly, but instead, you did everything through proper channels, with documentation, with integrity. You showed me what accountability actually looks like. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two sisters finally on the same side, finally free to build a relationship based on truth instead of competition. A week later, a formal letter arrived from the town council on official letterhead. Inside was an invitation to the annual community recognition ceremony held each spring to honor citizens who'd made significant contributions to the town's well-being. The letter was signed by the mayor and all 5 council members. We would like to honor you at the community recognition ceremony for your courage in pursuing justice through proper legal channels, your integrity in reporting fraud despite personal cost, and your vision in founding Cornerstone House to serve our community's most vulnerable residents. We understand this has been a difficult year for you, but we hope you'll allow us to recognize your strength and character publicly. Would you be willing to speak briefly at the ceremony about your experience and your hopes for Cornerstone House? I held the invitation, reading it twice to make sure it was real. The town that had whispered about me 6 months ago now wanted to honor me publicly. The community that had judged me for serving an eviction notice now understood I'd been protecting myself from a dangerous man. I called James to ask his opinion. "Should I accept?" "Robert would want you to," he said simply. "He believed in speaking truth to power and using your voice to help others. This is your chance to do both." I wrote back that evening, accepting the invitation and agreeing to speak. The community recognition ceremony took place on a warm May evening in the town hall's main auditorium, a space usually reserved for high school graduations and holiday concerts. I'd spent hours agonizing over what to wear before settling on a simple navy dress and low heels, professional, but not pretentious. Around my neck I wore the heirloom locket, and this time I knew exactly whose photos belonged inside. On one side, a picture of my father Robert from Uncle James's collection, and on the other the selfie Emma and I had taken at the cafe. The locket felt heavier now, weighted with meaning instead of mystery. The ceremony honored several community members, a teacher who'd served 40 years as a volunteer firefighter, a woman who'd organized food drives for 2 decades. When they called my name for the Courage and Integrity Award, I felt a flutter of nervousness I hadn't expected. The applause was warm and sustained as I walked to the podium, and I took a moment to look out at the audience before speaking. Margaret sat in the 3rd row, her hair styled and her smile genuine, looking healthier than she had in years. Beside her was Lily, who gave me a small encouraging nod. Emma sat in the front row, beaming with pride, flanked by Uncle James on one side and several church ladies on the other. I saw Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Chen from Church Pastor Michael, and even some of the relatives who'd laughed at Lily's wedding comment, but who'd since sent apologetic letters and donations to Cornerstone House. I adjusted the microphone and began, my voice steadier than I felt. "Thank you for this honor. 6 months ago I stood in a church and was told that adopted girls eat on the floor. Today I stand here being recognized for courage and integrity. That transformation didn't happen because I changed who I was. It happened because I finally refused to accept someone else's definition of who I should be." I paused, letting that sink in. People often ask me, "Have you forgiven your family?" It's a complicated question because people assume forgiveness means everything goes back to normal, that we all hug and pretend the harm never happened. But that's not what forgiveness is, at least not to me. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, and it isn't permission to continue harm. Forgiveness is refusing to let someone else's cruelty write my story going forward. Several women in the audience were nodding, some reaching for tissues. I continued. "I've forgiven my mother for being too scared to protect me when I needed her. I understand that she was trapped in her own nightmare, and that fear makes us do things we'd never do in safety. I'm learning to forgive my sister for years of programmed cruelty, because I now understand she was raised to see me as competition rather than family. But here's the crucial part. Forgiveness doesn't mean I tear down the boundaries that keep me safe." I gripped the podium, making sure my words were clear. Reconciliation requires 2 things: that forgiveness doesn't genuine remorse and changed behavior. I can forgive someone from across a room, from across town, even from across the country. But I can only reconcile up close and only when it's safe to do so. My mother showed remorse and changed. My sister showed remorse and changed. That's why they're here tonight. But the man who hurt us all showed neither remorse nor change, which is why he's in prison. Both outcomes are justice, just different kinds. The room was absolutely silent, except for the soft sound of people crying quietly. I glanced at Margaret, who was weeping openly, and at Lily, who had her hand pressed to her mouth. "There's a verse in Scripture," I continued, "about the stone the builders rejected becoming the cornerstone. Uncle James showed me that verse in my father's Bible where he'd underlined it years ago. For most of my life I believed I was rejected because I wasn't good enough, not pretty enough, not smart enough, not really family enough. But I understand now that I was rejected because I wouldn't break. And you can't build a healthy structure on something you've already broken." I saw several older women nodding vigorously, understanding this truth from their own lives. You can build an entire foundation on something, on someone who stayed whole even when the world tried to shatter her. Cornerstone House will stand on that principle, that the women who've been rejected, dismissed, and discarded are often the strongest foundations for a community that values dignity over dominance, truth over appearances, and safety over keeping secrets. I took a breath, feeling emotion rising in my throat. I want to thank this community for seeing past the gossip and the confusion to understand what was really happening. I want to thank Pastor Michael for teaching me that boundaries aren't unchristian, they're necessary. I want to thank Uncle James, who never stopped searching for me, who kept my father's memory alive, and who showed me that family can be found even after decades of separation. I looked at Margaret. I want to thank my mother for finally choosing truth and freedom over fear, even though it cost her everything she thought she needed. That took more courage than I think people realize. Then I turned to Lily. I want to thank my sister for being willing to say publicly that she was wrong for doing the hard work of understanding how she was both victim and participant, and for committing to make amends through actions instead of just words. Finally, I looked at Emma, whose eyes were shining with tears. And I want to thank Emma, my daughter, who I was forced to give up 20 years ago, but who found her way back to me anyway. She taught me that love can be found even in what was stolen. That time and distance don't erase connection, and that it's never too late to build something real out of something broken. The audience erupted in applause, a standing ovation that lasted for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. I stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed, as the mayor came to shake my hand and present me with a plaque I'd probably hang in the Cornerstone House lobby. As I made my way off the stage, an usher touched my arm gently. She was an older woman I recognized from church functions. "Ms. Sullivan," she said quietly, "there's a man here asking to see you. He came in late and is waiting in the hallway. He says he knew your father, Robert. His name is Dr. Marcus Chen." My heart stuttered. Marcus Chen. Lily's biological father. The man who had no idea she existed. Doctor. Marcus Chen turned out to be a kind-faced man in his early 70s with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, exactly as he'd looked in the old photo Margaret had shown us. The conversation that followed was brief but profound. He'd read about the trial and recognized Margaret's name, put pieces together about timing and circumstances, and wanted to meet Lily if she was willing. Lily was willing, and their first meeting 2 days later was tearful and healing in ways neither of them expected. But that's a story that belongs to Lily, not to me. What belonged to me came 3 weeks after the ceremony when James called with news I'd been half expecting. Frank's attorney contacted me. Frank has been diagnosed with terminal liver cancer. Stage 4. The doctors give him 6 to 12 months. He's asked to see you. My first instinct was refusal, immediate and visceral. But James continued. He wrote you a letter. I've reviewed it for manipulation tactics and coercion patterns. It reads like a genuine attempt at apology, though I can't guarantee his motives. You're under absolutely no obligation to see him, Vanessa. You owe him nothing. I asked James to send me the letter, and I read it 3 times over the next 2 days. Frank's handwriting was shaky, his words uncharacteristically humble. He wrote about facing death and realizing that everything he'd built, the reputation, the control, the carefully maintained image, meant nothing. He asked if I would visit so he could apologize in person. I know I don't deserve your time or your presence, he wrote. But I'm asking anyway, not for my sake, but because you deserve to hear me say the things I should have said 37 years ago. I discussed it with my therapist, who reminded me that I could say no without guilt. I talked to Margaret, who said she'd support whatever I decided. I talked to Emma, who had never met Frank, but who listened carefully, and then said, "Sometimes closure means walking away, and sometimes it means facing the thing that scared you, and realizing it can't hurt you anymore. Only you know which one you need." After 4 days of consideration, I told James I'd go. Not for him, I said. For me. To close that chapter on my terms and my time with my words. He doesn't get to die without hearing what he took from me. The prison visiting room was nothing like I'd imagined from television. It was smaller, more institutional, with scratched plexiglass barriers and metal stools bolted to the floor. But Frank and I were granted a face-to-face visit in a separate room designated for attorney meetings, perhaps because of his terminal diagnosis and the guard's assessment that a dying 66-year-old man posed minimal threat. When they brought Frank in, I barely recognized him. He'd lost at least 40 pounds. His skin had a grayish pallor, and he moved slowly like every step caused pain. The orange prison jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. He looked old and diminished, and nothing like the man who'd controlled my entire childhood through fear and manipulation. We sat across from each other at a small table, and Frank immediately began trying to explain himself, to contextualize, to make me understand the pressures he'd faced. I held up my hand. Stop. I didn't come here for your excuses or your justifications. If you want to apologize, then apologize. If you can't do that, I'm leaving right now. Frank's face crumpled, and he started crying, something I'd never seen him do in my entire life. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry for everything. I was terrified my whole life of being nothing, not successful enough, not masculine enough, not in control enough. When Robert died and I saw a chance to have Margaret, I took it without thinking about what it would cost her or you. I built my entire life on lies, because the truth made me feel inadequate. He looked at me directly for the first time. You were always better than me, Vanessa. Smarter, more capable, more ethical. That terrified me because it reminded me every single day that I hadn't actually earned anything. Not my family, not my reputation, not even my own sense of worth. So I spent 37 years trying to diminish you, to make you small enough that I could feel big. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the adoption lie, for treating you like property, for trying to murder your mother, for stealing Emma from you. I'm sorry for all of it. It wasn't a perfect apology. He still centered his own fear and inadequacy rather than my pain. But it was more honest than anything he'd ever said to me, and I could see that facing death had stripped away at least some of his defenses. I took a breath and spoke the words I'd been preparing for days. I accept your apology, but that doesn't undo the harm. You stole my mother's autonomy for 37 years. You stole my childhood and my sense of belonging. You stole the first 20 years of my daughter's life from me. You stole Lily's sense of self and taught her to be cruel to protect herself. You built a house of lies and called it family, and when it started to crumble, you tried to burn it down with my mother inside. Frank's tears continued, but I kept going. I forgive you, Frank. Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to hatred hurts me more than it hurts you. But understand this. I forgive you, the person. I don't forgive the actions. I don't forget. And I won't pretend we're reconciled, or that you were anything other than what you were, an abusive, controlling man who destroyed the people who trusted him. I stood up, ready to leave. You're going to die soon, and you'll die knowing that your greatest legacy isn't your business deals or your reputation or the image you worked so hard to build. Your legacy is Cornerstone House, built on the land where your lies literally burned down. Women you tried to erase are being lifted up there. Daughters you tried to control are finding freedom there. That's your real legacy, the good that rose from your ashes. Frank nodded slowly, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that he was receiving more grace than he'd ever shown anyone else. Thank you for coming, he whispered. I know I don't deserve it. You don't, I agreed. But I deserve the chance to say these things to your face and to walk out of here on my own terms. Goodbye, Frank. As I walked out of that prison through the security checkpoints and metal detectors and locked doors, I felt something lift off my shoulders. Not because Frank had apologized or because he'd finally acknowledged his damage, but because I'd faced him from a position of strength and said everything I needed to say. I'd given him truth instead of comfort, honesty instead of reconciliation, and walked away knowing I'd done it not for him, but for myself. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in August, James called. Frank passed away this morning. Liver failure. It was relatively quick at the end. There's going to be a small funeral, just the prison chaplain and whatever family shows up. No one expects you to go, Vanessa. You've given more than enough. He paused. But Margaret called me. She asked if you'd help her write a eulogy. Not for Frank, she said. For the life she survived. Margaret and I wrote Frank's eulogy together over coffee in my apartment, a surreal experience that felt more like exorcism than mourning. We spoke honestly about the man he'd been controlling, manipulative, abusive, but also acknowledged that he'd been shaped by his own fears and inadequacies. The eulogy Margaret delivered at the small funeral was brief and truthful. Frank Sullivan was my husband for 37 years. He gave me 2 daughters, though not in the ways anyone knew. He taught me about control and fear, and eventually he taught me about freedom by showing me what I needed to escape from. I hope he found peace at the end. I know I've found it now. Only 6 people attended Margaret Lily Uncle James, the prison chaplain, and 2 distant cousins who came out of obligation. I stayed home having said everything I needed to say in that prison visiting room. 1 year after the fire that nearly took Margaret's life, Cornerstone House stood completed on the exact site where Frank's House of Lies had once stood. The building was nothing like the old colonial that had burned. This structure was modern and welcoming, built with wide windows that let in abundant natural light ramps for accessibility and an open floor plan that felt spacious rather than institutional. The architect, a woman who'd escaped an abusive marriage herself, had designed it with intention. No dark corners, no rooms that couldn't be easily exited, no spaces where someone could feel trapped. Inside were 6 private apartment units, each with a small kitchenette and bathroom providing temporary housing for women and children fleeing dangerous situations. The communal areas included a large kitchen where residents could cook together and learn financial literacy through meal planning. A children's playroom painted in cheerful colors with donated toys and books. A small library with legal resources and self-help materials. Therapy rooms where licensed counselors volunteered their time, and offices where attorneys provided free consultations on restraining orders, divorce proceedings, and custody disputes. Outside, we'd built a garden with raised beds where residents could grow vegetables and herbs, a therapeutic space where hands in soil could begin healing hearts. And at the building's corner, embedded in the foundation where everyone entering would see it was the cornerstone, Uncle James had commissioned a granite block engraved with, "Founded by Vanessa Sullivan, built on truth, standing in grace." Opening day arrived on a perfect October afternoon, exactly 1 year after that terrible wedding. The community turned out in force. Mayor Richardson and 3 council members, Pastor Michael and what seemed like half the church congregation, Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Whitaker, and dozens of other older women who'd quietly supported the project, local contractors, who'd donated labor and reporters from 3 newspapers. But most importantly, there were the first residents, Patricia, a 62-year-old woman leaving a 40-year marriage, Maya, a 35-year-old mother of 2 escaping financial abuse, and Jennifer, a 50-year-old whose adult children had isolated her from friends and controlled her finances. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was simple, but profound. Margaret stood beside me wearing a blue dress and the confident posture of a woman who'd reclaimed her own life. She'd moved into a small apartment I'd helped her secure, started volunteering with a domestic violence hotline, and rebuilt her relationship with both her daughters through consistent action rather than empty promises. Lily stood on my other side, having spent the past 6 months volunteering during construction and training to become a peer counselor for women who'd been manipulated by family members. She wore jeans and a Cornerstone House t-shirt, no longer needing designer labels to prove her worth. Emma held one end of the ceremonial ribbon, her social work degree completed, and an official internship at Cornerstone House beginning the following week. She'd started calling me Mom 3 months earlier, tentatively at first, and then with increasing ease, and the word still made my heart swell every time I heard it. The 4 of us, 3 generations of women who'd been controlled, separated, and wounded by one man's pathology, stood united by truth and ready to cut a ribbon that symbolized so much more than a building opening. Uncle James stepped forward to offer a dedicatory prayer, his voice steady and full of emotion. My brother Robert believed in justice that heals, not just punishes. He believed in protecting the vulnerable and giving voice to the voiceless. This building is his legacy too, the dream he had of a world where women don't have to choose between safety and survival. May everyone who enters here find the protection, resources, and dignity that Robert would have wanted for his daughter, and for all daughters. Dr. Marcus Chen, who'd become an unexpected friend over the past months, and who'd formed a careful, respectful relationship with Lily, announced he'd be providing pro bono medical consultations 1 day a week for residents. Even Michael Torres, Ethan's former business partner, who'd had no knowledge of the fraud, donated office supplies and computer equipment as a gesture of repentance for what his company had inadvertently enabled. We cut the ribbon together, 4 hands on 1 pair of scissors, and the crowd applauded as the doors officially opened. But the moment that mattered most came during the speaking portion of the ceremony, when Patricia asked if she could say a few words. She stood at the microphone, a dignified woman with silver hair and hands that trembled slightly as she adjusted the mic. "I'm 62 years old," she began. "I was married for 40 years to a man who controlled every penny, every decision, every friendship. When his control turned to physical violence last year, I knew I had to leave. But I had no credit in my own name, no bank account he didn't monitor, no job history because he'd made me quit working 35 years ago. My adult children sided with their father because they couldn't imagine the respectable man they knew could be what he actually was." Her voice strengthened. "I lived in my car for 2 weeks before a social worker told me about Cornerstone House. This place gave me more than a roof and more than a bed. It gave me back my name. For 40 years, I was his wife, their mother. Someone defined entirely by her relationships to other people. Here, I'm Patricia. Just Patricia. And I'm rebuilding a life where I get to decide who I am." The audience was utterly silent, except for the sound of people crying quietly. I walked over and embraced Patricia, and she whispered in my ear, "Thank you for understanding that abuse doesn't always leave bruises. Sometimes it just leaves you erased." As the ceremony concluded and guests began touring the building, I slipped away to the garden, needing a moment alone to process everything. The October sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and I stood among the raised beds thinking about how far we'd all come in a year. Emma found me there, her smile bright, and her eyes sparkling. "Mom," she said, and I still felt that flutter of joy at the word, "There's someone who wants to meet you. She just arrived. She says her name is Grace, and she heard you built a table where adopted girls don't eat on the floor." Grace turned out to be a young mother of 2 who'd seen a news article about Cornerstone House and traveled 3 hours with everything she owned in 2 garbage bags. Her story of escaping trafficking was harrowing, but her determination to build a new life was fiercer. She became our 7th resident that day, and watching Emma guide her through intake procedures with professional compassion made me realize how far we'd all come from that terrible wedding 2 years ago. 2 years. It seemed impossible that only 2 years had passed since Lily told me to eat on the floor, since I'd driven away in that sedan, since I'd discovered the truth about my parentage and Frank's decades of control. But the calendar didn't lie, and neither did the data we'd been carefully tracking since Cornerstone House opened its doors. In 24 months, we'd served over 200 women and children. Our success rate staggered even the social workers who'd initially been skeptical. 85% of our residents achieved financial independence and secured permanent housing within 12 months of entering the program. We'd facilitated 73 restraining orders, 42 divorces, and countless custody agreements that protected children from abusive parents. We'd taught financial literacy to women who'd never been allowed to see a bank statement, provided therapy to those who'd been told their pain didn't matter, and offered legal counsel to people who'd been convinced they had no rights. The state took notice. In September, I received a formal letter from the governor's office informing me I'd been selected as the state's Humanitarian of the Year. The ceremony took place in the Capitol, in a gilded ballroom that felt absurdly fancy compared to the work boots and garden soil that were my daily uniform at Cornerstone House. Governor Martinez, a woman in her 60s who'd built her political career on criminal justice reform and victim advocacy, presented the award herself. "Cornerstone House has become a model that 3 other counties are already replicating," she said, reading from prepared remarks while looking directly at me. "Vanessa Sullivan didn't just build a shelter. She built a philosophy that the women society dismisses and discards are often the strongest foundation for communities that value dignity, truth, and justice. This award recognizes not just what she's built, but who she's inspired others to become. When I accepted the Crystal Award heavy and ornate in my hands, I kept my speech brief. I'm accepting this on behalf of every woman who was told she was too much or not enough, who was silenced or dismissed, who was treated as property instead of a person. You are the cornerstones. I just helped build the house. The celebration dinner afterward felt like a family reunion, though this family looked nothing like the one I'd grown up in. Margaret sat beside me, vibrant and purposeful in a way I'd never seen during her years with Frank. She'd become a peer counselor at Cornerstone House, specializing in helping older women who'd stayed in abusive marriages for decades, who felt too old to start over, who'd lost themselves so completely they couldn't remember who they'd been before marriage. I can help them, she'd told me once, because I am them. I'm just further down the road of getting myself back. Lily sat across from us, animated, as she described the new financial literacy curriculum she'd developed. She ran that program now, teaching women how to establish credit-open bank accounts their abusers couldn't access, read contracts, and protect themselves from economic manipulation. She'd learned those skills the hard way, and she taught them with the passion of someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be financially trapped. Her relationship with Dr. Chen, her biological father, had developed slowly into something warm and genuine. He sat beside her now, sharing stories about his grandchildren, and asking Lily thoughtful questions about her work. Emma, my daughter, had completed her master's in social work and taken the position of full-time program director at Cornerstone House. At 22, she brought fresh perspective and boundless energy, balancing my caution with bold new ideas about trauma-informed care and restorative justice practices. Watching her lead staff meetings and advocate for residents with the fierce protection of someone who understood what it meant to be separated from family made me proud in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Uncle James, now 74, served on our nonprofit board and still practiced law part-time, taking pro bono cases for Cornerstone residents. He'd become the grandfather figure I'd never had, and his presence at every major milestone reminded me that my father Robert's legacy lived on through all of us. On a golden October afternoon, 2 years and 2 weeks after opening day, I sat on the front porch of Cornerstone House, shelling peas with an unlikely group of women. Mrs. Whitaker, now 84, had come to us 6 months ago after her own children placed her in a nursing home, where staff stole her jewelry and ignored her requests for basic dignity. Grace, the young mother, sat beside her infant while her older daughter played in the garden. Patricia, our first resident, had moved into her own apartment, but came back weekly to volunteer and mentor newer arrivals. We sat in comfortable silence, punctuated by conversation, the kind of easy companionship that comes from shared understanding. My phone rang, and I recognized the number as the County Social Services Department from a neighboring region. Ms. Sullivan, this is Director Pamela Wu from Riverside County. We've been studying your Cornerstone House model extensively, and our county commission has approved funding to establish 3 similar facilities in our area. Would you be willing to consult on the project? We'd like to replicate not just your structure, but your philosophy. I looked around at the women on the porch at the building that had risen from literal ashes, at the garden where vegetables grew in soil that had once been soaked in gasoline meant to destroy evidence of crimes. Nothing good grows from hatred, but everything can bloom from truth if you give it the right conditions. Yes, I told Director Wu, I'd be honored to help. After I hung up, I pulled out my planner and opened to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, Chapter 2, Building More Corners. Mrs. Whitaker leaned over to see what I was writing and chuckled. Still more work to do? She asked. Always, I said, smiling. But that's the thing about building foundations. Once you prove something can stand, others want to build on it too. Grace, who'd been quiet, spoke up tentatively. Vanessa, would you tell us how this all started? I've heard pieces, but I'd like to know the whole story. The other women murmured agreement, and I set down my planner, looking at each of them in turn. Let me tell you about a wedding where someone told me I wasn't fit to sit at the table. I began watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. I was told that adopted girls eat on the floor. And you know what? In that moment, something inside me that had been bending for 37 years finally stopped bending and started building instead. I paused, gathering my thoughts. Here's what I learned. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought when I didn't scream or cry or make a scene, it meant I was accepting their cruelty. But silence was just me building the table. I was gathering resources, documenting evidence, learning contracts and laws, establishing boundaries. They didn't even know existed until they crossed them. And now, I gestured to the building behind us, to the garden, to the women gathered together in safety and dignity. Now everyone has a seat. The women sat quietly for a moment. Then Mrs. Whitaker raised her glass of iced tea. "To building tables," she said. We all raised our glasses, and in that simple gesture, I felt the weight of everything we'd survived and everything we'd built. The story that started with humiliation had transformed into hope. The girl who'd been told to eat on the floor had become the woman who made sure no one ever had to hear those words again. And somewhere I like to think my father Robert was smiling. As the evening settled into comfortable quiet, and the women around me began gathering their things to head inside for dinner, I stayed on the porch a little longer, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the trees that lined the property. 2 years ago, I couldn't have imagined this moment, this peace, this purpose, this family built not on blood or obligation, but on truth and choice. I thought about that wedding, about standing in a church vestibule and hearing words designed to humiliate me in front of 200 people. I thought about the girl I'd been for 37 years, always trying to earn love that was never freely given, always proving my worth to people who'd decided I had none. And I thought about the woman I'd become, not in spite of that humiliation, but because I finally understood that their cruelty said everything about them and nothing about me. The journey from that moment to this one wasn't easy. It required facing painful truths about my family, about systems that enable abuse, about my own complicity in accepting less than I deserved. It required learning the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, between kindness and enabling, between keeping peace and keeping safe. Most importantly, it required understanding that setting boundaries isn't betrayal, it's self-respect. If you're listening to this story and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, I want you to know something. You are not alone. Whether you're the woman who's been told she should be grateful for scraps, the daughter who's been erased from family photos, the mother who's been controlled through fear, or the sister who's been programmed to compete instead of connect, you are not alone, and your silence doesn't have to be permanent. Building your own table doesn't mean you're destroying someone else's. It means you're finally claiming the dignity you were born deserving. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop accepting the unacceptable. Cornerstone House exists because one woman decided that eating on the floor was not her destiny. But it thrives because hundreds of women decided the same thing for themselves. That's the real story here. Not one person's triumph, but a community's choice to value truth over appearances, safety over silence, and dignity over control. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where you had to choose between keeping peace and keeping your dignity? Have you set boundaries that felt terrifying but necessary? Or maybe you're still in that moment trying to decide whether you deserve better than what you've been accepting. Whatever your story is, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about family forgiveness or what it means to build a life on your own terms, please consider subscribing to this channel. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that their silence can become strength, that rejection can become foundation, and that the tables we build for ourselves are always big enough to welcome others. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, they thought silence was weakness. But silence was just us building the table. And now everyone has a seat.